Before time bent toward its end, before cities rose and empires fell, there existed a boundary between heaven and earth, a veil, a silence, a sacred separation that was never meant to be crossed. In the highest realms, knowledge was kept, knowledge of the stars, of the hidden workings of creation, of things that moved beneath the surface of existence. This knowledge was not withheld in cruelty. It was withheld in mercy. For some truths are too heavy for mortal hands to carry. Some flames are too bright for eyes made of dust. Yet the veil was torn, not by accident, not by fate, but by choice. Certain beings, radiant and eternal, looked down upon the children of men and saw their ignorance. They saw humanity wandering in darkness, blind to the patterns woven into the fabric of the world, and in their compassion, or perhaps their pride, they descended. They crossed the boundary. They opened their mouths and spoke. They taught the secrets of the heavens. They revealed the hidden arts. They passed down what was never meant to be given. At first it seemed like a gift. The earth bloomed with new understanding. Humanity grew in power and skill, but with every lesson came a cost. With every revelation came corruption. The knowledge that was meant to bring light instead cast shadows. The gift became a curse. Heaven watched, heaven saw, and heaven regretted. What was taught could not be untaught. What was spoken could not be unheard. The consequences rippled across generations, staining the earth with violence, with sorcery, with rebellion against the divine order. The ones who had descended in mercy were now named transgressors. Their teaching was called sin. Their compassion was reframed as treason. This is the story of knowledge given in love and condemned in sorrow. The story of beings who believed they were helping, only to unleash devastation. The story of why heaven came to regret what it had shared with the world below. What happens when the eternal makes itself known to the mortal? What happens when the sacred becomes common? The answer lies in what was taught, what was lost, and what can never be undone. In the beginning, there was order. Not the order of human kingdoms, which rise and crumble with the passing of generations. Not the order of law written on stone or parchment, fragile and dependent on enforcement. This was the order woven into the foundation of all things, the structure beneath existence itself. Heaven remained above, earth remained below, and between them stretched an invisible boundary, ordained by the Creator before time had learned to move forward. This boundary was not a wall. It was not a barrier built from fear or mistrust. It was not a cage meant to imprison or a fence meant to exclude. It was a threshold, a line of separation that held both realms in their proper place, allowing each to flourish according to its design. Above, in the highest places, the heavens shimmered with light that had no source but itself. The angels dwelt there, beings fashioned from flame and wind, robed in radiance that never dimmed. They moved through realms of pure thought, where distance held no meaning and time bent to the will of eternity. They sang praises that had no melody, only presence. They carried knowledge that had no words, only understanding. The angels were not rulers, they were servants, guardians of mysteries too vast for mortal comprehension, keepers of truths that sustained the structure of creation. They knew the hidden names of stars. They understood the patterns woven into the fabric of matter and spirit. They held within them the blueprints of existence, how light bends, how breath becomes life, how thought becomes form. This knowledge was not theirs to own. It was theirs to steward. And they did so in silence, in obedience, in perfect alignment with the will that had spoken them into being. Below, the earth stretched wide beneath open skies. Mountains rose where the land buckled upward. Rivers carved their paths through stone and soil. Forests grew thick with green life, and deserts spread golden and still under endless sun. The earth was a realm of texture and weight, of seasons and cycles, of birth and death woven together in rhythms both gentle and fierce. Humanity walked upon this earth, creatures formed from dust, given breath, granted life. They lived in innocence, unaware of the forces that governed their existence. They did not know the machinery of the heavens. They did not see the angelic guardians stationed at the edges of perception. They did not understand the laws that held the stars in place or the threads that connected all things in a web too intricate to name. And this ignorance was not a flaw, it was a gift. Humanity was not made to carry the weight of cosmic knowledge. They were made to tend gardens, to name animals, to love and labor, and rest beneath skies they could never fully comprehend. Their minds were shaped for simpler things, for beauty, for wonder, for the quiet joy of being alive, without needing to understand why. The boundary between heaven and earth preserved this simplicity. It ensured that the eternal did not overwhelm the temporal, that the infinite did not crush the finite, that beings made from dust did not bear burdens meant only for beings made from light. This was not cruelty, this was mercy. The separation was sacred. It was intentional. It was a design so perfect that for ages uncounted, it held without question. Angels remained in their realm, serving their appointed roles. Humans remained in theirs, living within the limits of their making. And the Creator, who had fashioned both, looked upon the order and found it good. Heaven did not envy earth. Earth did not reach for heaven. There was no resentment in the separation, no longing to cross what should not be crossed. Each realm knew its place. Each being honored the boundary without even thinking to challenge it. This was harmony, not the harmony of music or voices blending in song, but the deeper harmony of things existing exactly as they were meant to exist. The harmony of balance, of proportion, of divine architecture holding firm beneath the surface of all that could be seen or touched or known. In heaven, the angels stood in their light, witnesses to the unfolding of time. They saw the beginning. They would see the end, but they did not interfere. They did not descend. They did not speak unless spoken through. Their role was to watch, to serve, to guard the mysteries entrusted to them. On earth, humanity grew and multiplied. They built shelters from wood and stone. They planted seeds and harvested grain. They told stories around fires, passed wisdom from elder to child, and gazed up at the stars without understanding what moved them. They lived in the present, bound to the rhythms of day and night, summer and winter, planting and reaping. And between these two realms, one eternal, one mortal, the boundary held. It was invisible, but it was real, more real than stone, more enduring than steel. It was woven into the very nature of existence, a line that could not be crossed without consequence, a threshold that required permission to pass, a veil that separated not to divide but to sustain. The boundary was not merely a line of separation. It was a principle, a law written into the fabric of creation itself, as fundamental as gravity, as unchanging as the movement of celestial bodies across the void. To understand the boundary, one must first understand what it protected. Heaven held knowledge that sustained existence, not the knowledge of how to build or craft or grow. Those were gifts already given to humanity, skills woven into their design. Heaven held the knowledge of why things were, the knowledge of origins and endings, the knowledge of forces that moved beneath the surface of the visible world, unseen but ever present. The angels knew the true names of things, not the names given by human tongues, but the names that called matter into form, that held atoms in their dance, that bound spirit to flesh. They understood the architecture of souls. They saw the threads of destiny woven through time, the choices that branched into infinite paths, the consequences that rippled across generations yet unborn. This knowledge was power, Not power as humans understood it, the power to rule or conquer or control. This was the power of creation itself, the power to unmake what had been made, the power to reshape reality according to will rather than design, the power to speak and see worlds shift in response. Such power was never meant for mortal hands. Humanity was crafted with intention. Their minds could grasp enough to survive, to thrive, to build communities and pass wisdom forward. But they were not made to hold infinity within finite vessels. Their spirits burned bright but brief, like candles lit for a season then extinguished. Their bodies were fragile, subject to injury and age and the slow decay of mortality. To give them the knowledge of heaven would be to pour an ocean into a cup. The vessel would shatter. The knowledge would destroy them from within. This was not a judgment of worth. It was a recognition of design. A bird is not lesser than a fish because it cannot breathe underwater. A flower is not weaker than a tree because it lives for a single season. Each creature is made for its purpose, fitted perfectly to its place in the order of things. Humanity's purpose was not to know all things. It was to live fully within the bounds of their making, to experience the world through senses of flesh and blood, to love with hearts that could break, to create with hands that would one day return to dust, to wonder at mysteries without needing to solve them. The boundary preserved this purpose. It kept heaven's knowledge in heaven, where it belonged. It kept humanity rooted in the earth, where they could flourish without being overwhelmed by truths too vast to carry. And for ages the system held. The angels looked down from their stations and saw humanity in all its beautiful limitation. They watched children born and elders passing. They witnessed the first songs, the first prayers, the first moments of awe when humans stared up at stars and felt something stir within them, a longing they could not name, a sense that something greater moved beyond the veil of their perception. The angels did not pity humanity for their ignorance. They recognized it as protection. They understood that the veil was a kindness, that the separation was a gift, that the boundary allowed mortal creatures to live without the crushing weight of cosmic awareness. Heaven did not hoard its knowledge out of greed. It guarded it out of love. There is a weight to knowing, a burden that comes with seeing too much, understanding too deeply, holding truths that cannot be forgotten or ignored. The angels carried this weight because they were made to carry it. Their nature was suited to the task. They did not tire. They did not break. They existed in a state beyond suffering, beyond the vulnerability that defined mortal life. But humanity was different. They were made to feel joy without needing to understand its source, to experience beauty without analyzing its composition, to love without dissecting the mechanics of affection. They were made to live in the immediacy of the present, unburdened by the infinite past and the unknowable future. The boundary protected this immediacy. It shielded humanity from the paralyzing awareness of all that moved in realms beyond their reach. It allowed them to focus on what was before them, the soil beneath their feet, the sky above their heads, the faces of those they loved, the work of their hands. And in this focus there was peace. Not the peace of ignorance born from stupidity or lack of curiosity, but the peace of creatures living exactly as they were meant to live. The peace of alignment with divine design. The peace of a world in balance, where each being occupied its proper place and did not strain against the limits set for its good. The boundary was a line of mercy. It divided heaven and earth not to separate them in hostility, but to preserve them in harmony. It ensured that the eternal did not consume the temporal, that the infinite did not overwhelm the finite, that knowledge meant for guardians did not spill into hands too fragile to hold it. This was the sacred architecture of creation. This was the order that preceded all disorder. This was the simplicity that existed before complexity entered the world and twisted it into shapes it was never meant to assume. Before the fall, before the teaching, before the transgression that would shatter the boundary and unleash consequences no one could have foreseen, there was harmony, and in that harmony there was a peace so profound that it required no defense, no explanation, no justification. It simply was. The nature of knowledge itself must be understood to grasp why the boundary was necessary. Not all knowledge sustains. Not all truths build up. Some knowledge, though accurate and real, carries within it the seeds of destruction, not because the knowledge itself is evil, but because it is too much, too soon, too heavy for the one who receives it. There are truths that liberate, the knowledge of how to plant and harvest, the understanding of which herbs heal and which harm, the wisdom of how to shelter from storms, how to preserve food through winter, how to care for the sick and comfort the grieving. These truths fit the human hand. They match the human need. They empower without overwhelming. But there are other truths, truths that do not serve survival or flourishing, truths that open doors better left closed, the knowledge of how to manipulate the unseen, the understanding of forces that govern fate and fortune, the secrets of how matter can be transformed, how spirits can be summoned, how the natural order can be bent to individual will. These truths do not liberate. They enslave. They create hunger that cannot be satisfied. They birth ambition that consumes everything in its path. They plant seeds of corruption that grow silently, spreading roots through the soul until nothing remains but the desire for more power, more control, more knowledge, more dominion over what was never meant to be dominated. Heaven held these truths not to hoard them, but to spare humanity from their weight. The angels understood this. They had seen what knowledge could do when placed in hands unready to hold it. They had witnessed the dangers of revelation without preparation, of truth without wisdom to guide its use. They knew that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Some words, once spoken, could never be unheard. And so they kept silent. They maintained their stations. They honored the boundary between what should be known and what should remain hidden. This was not oppression. This was guardianship. A parent does know. Give a sharp blade to a child, not because the blade is evil or the child is unworthy, but because the child is not yet ready to wield such a tool without harm. The parent waits, watches, knows that in time, when the child has grown and matured and learned discipline, the tool can be passed down safely. The boundary between heaven and earth operated on this same principle. Humanity was young, not in years, for generations had already passed, but in development. They had not yet learned the discipline required to handle cosmic knowledge. They had not yet developed the wisdom to know when to seek understanding and when to accept mystery. They lived in a state of sacred innocence, not ignorance born from lack of intelligence, but innocence born from proper order. They knew what they needed to know. They lived as they were meant to live. And the rest, the vast machinery of heaven, the hidden workings of creation, the knowledge that moved stars and bound worlds, remained beyond the veil, held in trust by beings made to hold it. This was the peace that existed before the breaking. The earth turned in its rhythm. Seasons changed. Rain fell and crops grew. Children were born and learned the ways of their ancestors. Elders passed down stories of the first days, of the garden, of the breath that brought life to dust. Humanity worshipped in simplicity, offering thanks for harvests, singing praises for the beauty of creation, standing in awe of forces they could feel but not explain. And heaven watched. The angels observed without interfering. They saw the innocence and recognized it as something precious, something fragile, something that would not survive the weight of knowledge premature and unrestrained. The boundary held because all beings honored it. Angels did not descend uninvited. Humans did not reach beyond their station. The order was maintained not through force but through alignment. Each realm understood its place. Each creature lived within its design. There was no resentment in this arrangement, no sense of injustice or deprivation. Humanity did not feel cheated by what they did not know. They did not rage against limits they had never tested. They lived in the fullness of what they were, not in the shadow of what they were not. This was harmony in its truest form, not the absence of difference but the presence of right relationship. Heaven above, earth below, and between them a boundary that preserved both in their proper place. It was a system so perfect that it required no enforcement. It was a design so complete that it needed no correction. It was an order so pure that it stood without question for ages beyond counting. But nothing crafted from choice remains unchanged forever. And within the heavenly realm, within the ranks of the watchers appointed to observe humanity, something began to shift. A question began to form. A compassion began to grow, compassion that would become the seed of rebellion, the crack in the foundation, the moment when angels looked down at human ignorance and wondered if the boundary was truly mercy or merely restriction. The harmony would not last. The simplicity would not endure. The boundary would be tested, crossed, shattered. And when it broke, the knowledge heaven had guarded would spill into the world below, bringing with it consequences no one had foreseen. But before the breaking, there was this moment of perfect order, this age of sacred separation, this time when all things existed as they were meant to exist, and the boundary between heaven and earth stood unbroken, unchallenged, and absolute. High above the earth, stationed at the edges of perception, certain angels were appointed as watchers. They were not the highest of the heavenly host, not the seraphim who stood nearest the throne, burning with fire that consumed nothing, not the cherubim who guarded sacred thresholds with flaming swords and eyes that saw in all directions at once. The watchers occupied a different station, a unique role in the hierarchy of heaven. They were observers, guardians assigned to watch over humanity from a distance, to witness the unfolding of mortal life without interfering in its course. They stood at the boundary between realms, positioned where heaven met earth, where the eternal looked down upon the temporal. Their task was simple: watch, observe, bear witness, nothing more. They did not speak to those below. They did not reveal themselves. They did not intervene in human affairs or guide human choices. They were silent sentinels, present but unseen, aware but uninvolved. Their purpose was to observe the great experiment of mortality, to see how creatures made from dust would live when given freedom, when granted will, when allowed to choose their own paths within the boundaries of their design. And so they watched. They watched as the first cities rose from the earth. Humanity, no longer content to wander, began to settle. They built walls from mud and stone. They planted fields in ordered rows. They gathered in communities, learning to live not as scattered families but as unified peoples bound by shared labor and common need. The watchers saw the first fires lit in darkness. They watched humans discover that flame could be harnessed, controlled, passed from torch to torch without dying. They witnessed the wonder on human faces when warmth pushed back the cold, when light carved spaces of safety in the night. They observed the first children born under stars those children could not name, infants cradled in mortal arms, eyes opening to a world they would spend their brief lives trying to understand. The watchers saw parents teaching their young how to speak, how to walk, how to recognize danger and seek shelter. They witnessed the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the slow accumulation of wisdom earned through trial and error, through failure and success. From their stations above, the watchers beheld the beauty of human struggle. It was not a beauty born from perfection. Humanity stumbled often. They made mistakes. They built shelters that collapsed in storms. They planted crops that withered in drought. They argued among themselves, divided by jealousy and misunderstanding. They suffered injuries that left them weakened, illnesses that swept through communities like invisible fire. But they endured, they learned, they adapted, and in their persistence there was something magnificent. The Watchers saw courage in the face of uncertainty. They saw love binding families together even when hardship threatened to tear them apart. They saw creativity sparking in human minds, the invention of tools, the crafting of art, the formation of songs that carried emotion beyond the limits of simple words. They witnessed innocence, not the innocence of ignorance, but the innocence of creatures living fully within the present moment. Humans did not know what moved the stars across the sky, but they sang to those stars anyway. They did not understand the forces that brought rain or held back floods, but they offered prayers of gratitude when water came and prayers of pleading when it did not. There was purity in this not knowing, a simplicity that the Watchers recognized as sacred. For ages they observed without feeling anything beyond their duty. They were angels, after all, beings of light and obedience. Their purpose was clear. Their role was defined. They had no reason to question what they had been assigned to do. But over time, slowly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. Observation is not a neutral act. To watch is to become involved, even from a distance. To witness suffering is to feel its weight. To see beauty is to be moved by its presence. The Watchers had been stationed to observe humanity, and observe they did. But observation turned to something deeper. It turned to affection. They began to see humanity not as subjects of study, not as lesser beings existing far below the glory of heaven. They began to see them as something precious, something vulnerable, something worthy of care. The Watchers watched children stumble in darkness because no one had taught them to read the signs of coming danger. They watched families grieve over losses that might have been prevented with knowledge the Watchers held but could not share. They watched communities torn apart by conflicts born from misunderstanding, from fear of the unknown, from ignorance of better ways to live. And within the hearts of the Watchers, a question began to form. Why? Why should these creatures remain in darkness? When light could be offered. Why should they stumble when guidance could steady their steps? Why should they suffer from ignorance when knowledge could ease their burdens? The Watchers knew the answer. They had been told. The boundary existed for a reason. Humanity was not ready for the knowledge heaven held. To give such knowledge prematurely would be to destroy what it was meant to help. But understanding a reason and accepting it are not the same thing. Distance, once maintained without effort, began to feel like a burden. The Watchers had stood at their posts for ages uncounted, observing without involvement, witnessing without interfering. But the longer they watched, the harder it became to remain detached. Every generation of humanity they observed brought new faces, new struggles, new moments of beauty mixed with suffering. And with each passing age, the affection within the Watchers deepened. They began to see humanity not as a distant project but as children, lost children, wandering in darkness not because they chose ignorance but because no one had shown them the way forward. The Watchers told themselves they were simply fulfilling their duty, that their growing concern was natural, even appropriate. After all, were they not appointed to watch over these creatures? Did their assignment not imply some level of care, some responsibility beyond mere observation? But care, unchecked, becomes attachment, and attachment leads to desire, the desire to act, the desire to help, the desire to cross boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. The Watchers began to question the wisdom of heaven's design. They did not question openly. They did not voice rebellion or challenge the throne with arguments and accusations. The questioning happened quietly in the hidden places of their beings where thought formed before it became word. Small doubts, gentle uncertainties, questions that seemed reasonable, even compassionate. Why should humanity struggle so much when the solution was so simple? Why should knowledge be withheld when sharing it would alleviate suffering? Why should the boundary remain when crossing it could bring such good? The watchers believed they understood what heaven had ordained. They had heard the reasons. They knew the divine logic behind the separation of realms, but knowing a thing and agreeing with it are not the same. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the watchers began to believe they saw something heaven had missed. They saw potential in humanity that was being wasted, gifts left undeveloped, capabilities lying dormant for lack of proper instruction. They watched humans reinvent solutions to problems the angels could solve in moments. They watched communities destroyed by plagues that angelic knowledge could prevent. They watched ignorance breed fear and fear breed violence. And they began to believe that mercy demanded action. This was the subtlety of their fall. It did not begin with hatred or rage. It did not start with a desire to overthrow or rebel. It began with compassion, with the sincere belief that they were seeing something true, something right, something that aligned with the very heart of divine love. Surely, they reasoned, the Creator would not want His children to suffer needlessly. Surely heaven's love extended beyond rigid adherence to boundaries. Surely there was room for mercy to override law when the need was great enough. The watchers looked down and saw humanity as sheep without a shepherd, blind without a guide, lost without a map to show them the way home. And they believed, truly, deeply believed, that they could help. Among the watchers, conversations began. Quiet exchanges at first, tentative and uncertain. One would mention the struggles they had witnessed. Another would agree, adding observations of their own. A third would wonder aloud whether something could be done, whether their role might expand beyond mere observation. No single moment marked the turning point. No dramatic declaration of rebellion echoed through the heavenly realm. The erosion of obedience happened slowly, like water wearing down stone. One doubt led to another. One question opened the door to 10 more. One moment of compassion grew into a conviction that action was not only justified but necessary. The watchers began to see themselves not as servants bound by duty, but as potential saviors moved by love. They compared themselves to humanity and saw the vast difference in knowledge and power. They held within themselves understanding that could transform human civilization. They knew the movements of stars, the properties of herbs, the secrets of metal and stone. They understood how to read signs written in the heavens, how to predict seasons, how to craft tools that would make labor easier and life more secure. All of this knowledge sat within them, unused, unshared, while below them humanity struggled in ignorance. It seemed wasteful, it seemed cruel, it seemed to the watchers like a tragedy that could be prevented, if only they were willing to step beyond the limits of their assigned role. The dangerous thing about their reasoning was that it was not entirely wrong. Humanity did struggle. Knowledge would help them. Teaching would illuminate their path. These facts were true, but truth, isolated from wisdom, becomes a weapon that cuts the one who wields it. The watchers failed to see what heaven understood, that some help harms, that some gifts poison, that compassion without permission is not love but presumption, that crossing boundaries set by divine wisdom, no matter how good the intention, is still transgression. They believed they were acting in mercy. They believed they were extending the love of heaven to those who needed it most. They believed their hearts were pure and their motives righteous. But belief does not make a thing true, and good intentions do not sanctify disobedience. The watchers stood at the edge of decision. Behind them lay ages of faithful observation, of duty fulfilled, of boundaries honored. Before them lay the possibility of dissent, of teaching, of sharing what they had been commanded to guard. They told themselves it was not rebellion. They convinced themselves it was compassion. They believed they were doing what heaven itself would do if heaven truly understood the depth of human need. The inner conflict of the watchers was not a battle between good and evil. It was a battle between obedience and compassion, between duty and desire, between the law given and the love felt. They were not monsters. They were not demons plotting destruction. They were angels who had watched humanity for so long that the distance between heaven and earth had begun to feel unbearable. They were beings of light who had come to care deeply for creatures made of dust. And in that caring, a seed was planted, a seed that would grow into the greatest transgression the heavenly realm had yet witnessed. The watchers began to justify what they were considering. They reasoned that the boundary was meant to protect humanity from harm, not to keep them perpetually weak. They argued that heaven's love was not rigid but flexible, not bound by law but expressed through mercy. They convinced themselves that what they were contemplating was not rebellion but evolution, a natural progression from observation to involvement, from watching to guiding. Some among them were more hesitant than others. Some felt the weight of what they were considering and pulled back from the edge, but others pressed forward, their conviction growing stronger with each passing age. And those who pressed forward began to gather others to their cause. Conversations became counsels, observations became arguments, questions became plans. The leader among them, an angel named Semjaza, voiced what many were thinking but few dared to say aloud. If they were going to act, they must act together. No single watcher could bear the weight of such a decision alone. The responsibility and the consequence must be shared. Others agreed. Azazel, who had watched humanity struggle with primitive tools and dreamed of teaching them the secrets of metal and fire. Raphael, who had observed the stars and longed to share their meanings. Gabriel, who understood signs and omens and believed humanity deserved to read what was written in the heavens. One by one, the watchers who had been moved from observation to affection, from affection to longing, from longing to conviction, began to align. They did not see themselves as rebels. They saw themselves as merciful. They did not believe they were betraying heaven. They believed they were extending heaven's love in a way that heaven itself had failed to do. This was the tragedy of their fall. It was not born from malice but from misplaced compassion, not from hatred but from love twisted just enough to become dangerous, not from a desire to destroy but from a desire to help offered without permission, without wisdom, without understanding the full weight of what they were about to unleash. The watchers looked at humanity and saw children stumbling in darkness. They looked at themselves and saw the light those children needed, and they made a choice that would shatter the boundary between realms and bring consequences no one could have imagined. They decided to descend. Not in judgment, not in wrath, but in what they believed was mercy. They would go down to the earth. They would walk among humanity. They would teach what heaven had kept hidden. They would share the knowledge that angels held, believing that in doing so they were acting in love. But mercy without permission is not mercy, it is presumption. Compassion that overrides divine command is not compassion, it is pride. Love that breaks sacred boundaries is not love, it is rebellion, no matter how gently it speaks or how pure it believes itself to be. The watchers did not see this. They had convinced themselves so thoroughly of the righteousness of their cause that they could no longer distinguish between what they wanted to be true and what was actually true. They had spent so long watching humanity that they had forgotten their place. They had observed for so long that they believed observation gave them the right, even the duty, to intervene. They told themselves they were helping. They believed they were acting in alignment with heaven's heart, even if not with heaven's command. They thought they understood better than the silence they had been given. They assumed their compassion was wiser than the boundary that had stood since creation. And in that assumption, they crossed the line from servant to savior, from messenger to master, from guardian to transgressor. The decision was made. The covenant was sworn. The 200 watchers who had been moved by what they had seen, who had been stirred by affection, turned to dangerous compassion, who had questioned the wisdom of heaven and found their own reasoning more convincing. They agreed to descend together. They would leave their posts. They would cross the boundary. They would bring knowledge to humanity, believing they were bringing light. They would teach what had been forbidden, believing they were offering mercy. Their intentions were not evil. That is what made their fall so tragic. They were not demons seeking destruction. They were angels moved by love, love that had grown without restraint, love that had convinced itself it knew better than obedience, love that believed the end justified the means. But good intentions do not sanctify transgression. Pure motives do not erase consequence. And love, when it operates outside the boundaries of divine wisdom, becomes the most dangerous force in creation. The watchers stood at the threshold between heaven and earth, ready to cross, ready to teach, ready to help, ready to do what they believed was right, even though every law of heaven stood against it. They did not know what they were about to unleash. They did not see the corruption that would follow. They did not understand that some knowledge, once given, becomes a curse rather than a blessing. They did not grasp that the boundary they were about to shatter was not a restriction but a protection, a mercy that kept humanity from burdens they were never meant to bear. The watchers looked down with compassion, and in that compassion, rebellion was born, not with thunder or fire, not with declaration or defiance, but with the quiet conviction that mercy demanded what obedience forbade. And so they prepared to fall. The decision was made in secret, away from the eyes of heaven's throne. 200 watchers gathered at a place between realms, a summit that rose from the earth yet reached toward the heavens. Mount Hermon, a sacred peak crowned with snow, its slopes shrouded in mist, its heights touching clouds that drifted between worlds. The mountain's name itself carried weight. Hermon, meaning sacred, consecrated, set apart. Some would later say it meant cursed, a name forever bound to what transpired upon its heights. But in that moment, before the oath was sworn, before the descent began, it was simply a threshold, a place where earth met sky, where the boundary between heaven and earth grew thin enough to cross. The watchers assembled in silence. 200 angels who had stood at their posts for ages, who had watched humanity from a distance, who had been moved from observation to affection to conviction. They came together not in open rebellion but in shared purpose. They believed what they were about to do was right. They believed mercy demanded it. But they also understood the weight of what they contemplated. No single watcher could bear the burden of such a decision alone. To descend uninvited, to cross the boundary that had stood since creation, to teach what heaven had forbidden, this was transgression of the highest order. The consequence would be severe. The judgment would be absolute. And so they agreed. They would share the guilt. They would divide the weight of rebellion among all who participated. No one would stand alone before heaven's throne when the reckoning came. They would fall together or not at all. Semjaza stood among them, recognized as leader not through force but through conviction. He had been the first to voice what many were thinking. He had been the one to gather the others, to articulate the vision, to propose the plan. But even he felt the gravity of the moment. He spoke, and his voice carried across the mountain peak. Let us swear an oath. Let us bind ourselves together by covenant so that no one among us turns back when the time comes. Let us share this equally, the choice, the action, the consequence. The others agreed. They understood what was being asked. An oath sworn by angels was not a casual promise. It was a binding of essence, a weaving of will into unbreakable commitment. Once spoken, it could not be undone. Once sealed, it would hold them accountable not just to one another, but to the fabric of creation itself. They swore together, each voice joining the others in a single declaration. They bound themselves by curse as much as by promise, agreeing that if any among them faltered, if any turned back or failed to fulfill what they had sworn, they would bear not only their own consequence but the weight of all 200 transgressions. The oath was made, the covenant was sealed, there was no turning back. Among the 200 stood others whose names would echo through ages. Azazel, who had watched humanity struggle with primitive tools and longed to teach them the secrets of metalworking. Gabriel, who understood the movements of stars and believed humanity deserved to read what was written in the heavens. Raphael, Armaros, Penemu, each moved by what they had seen, each convinced that teaching was mercy, each willing to cross the line that should never have been crossed. They descended. Not slowly, not cautiously. They fell like stars torn from their places in the heavens, blazing trails of light across the night sky. The boundary between realms, which had stood firm since creation, tore open. The veil that separated the eternal from the temporal ripped like fabric under too much weight. The descent was fire and thunder. It was the sound of something breaking that was never meant to break. It was the moment when order gave way to chaos, when the sacred architecture of creation suffered its first catastrophic wound. They fell, and the earth trembled beneath them. Animals sensed what was happening before humans did. Lions roared in valleys far from their hunting grounds. Wolves howled at skies that burned with falling light. Birds took flight in great clouds, scattering in every direction as if fleeing from something they could not name. Humans looked up and saw fire streaking across the darkness. Comets that moved with purpose rather than random trajectory. Lights that fell not from the distant stars but from somewhere closer, somewhere just beyond the edge of what mortal eyes could perceive. Some fell to their knees in terror. Others stood frozen, unable to look away. A few ran, seeking shelter from whatever was descending, but most simply watched, caught between awe and fear, witnessing something no human had ever seen. The watchers arrived. They did not arrive as shadows or whispers. They came in their full radiance, beings of light stepping into a world of flesh and dust. When the watchers touched the earth, the ground itself seemed to respond. Grass bent beneath feet that had never known weight. Soil compressed under the presence of beings who had existed only in realms where gravity held no meaning. The air around them shimmered, distorted by the proximity of something too bright, too pure, too other to belong in mortal lands. The humans who witnessed the arrival stood paralyzed. Fear and wonder warred within them, neither emotion fully capturing what they felt. These were not men, not animals, not any creature they had encountered or imagined. These were beings that radiated authority and power, beings whose very presence commanded attention without demanding it. The watchers appeared in forms that could be seen but barely comprehended. They wore the shape of men, 2 arms, 2 legs, faces with eyes and mouths, but everything about them was too perfect, too symmetrical, too luminous to be merely human. Their skin glowed faintly, as if lit from within. Their eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire skies. When they moved with grace that defied the limitations of mortal bodies. They were beautiful in a way that transcended simple attraction. It was the beauty of fire, of lightning, of forces too powerful to be safe, yet too magnificent to ignore. For a long moment, neither watchers nor humans spoke. The angels stood in silence, adjusting to the strangeness of existence in physical form. They felt weight for the first time, the pull of the earth beneath them, the pressure of air against bodies they had fashioned for this purpose. They felt temperature, the cool night breeze moving across skin they had created to house their essence. It was alien, uncomfortable, limiting, but also thrilling in its newness. The humans, for their part, could not find words. What does one say when confronted with the divine made visible? How does one address beings who emanate power that makes the strongest warrior seem weak, wisdom that makes the eldest elder seem young? Finally, Semjaza stepped forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible and his posture open. He did not want to frighten those he had come to help. He had descended in mercy, not terror. He had come to teach, not to dominate. When he spoke, his voice carried weight that had nothing to do with volume. It resonated in a way that bypassed ears and touched something deeper, the chest, the bones, the core of whoever listened. "Do not fear," he said. "We have not come to harm you." The words were simple, but they carried truth that could be felt as much as heard. This was not deception. Whatever these beings were, whatever they intended, they did not come with malice. A brave soul among the humans, a young man who had watched the descent from beginning to end, found his voice. "What are you?" Semjaza considered the question. How could he explain in terms these creatures would understand? How could he convey the nature of angels to beings who had never conceived of such existence? "We are watchers," he said, "servants of the Most High appointed to observe your kind. We have watched you from the beginning. We have seen your struggles and your triumphs. We have witnessed your ignorance and your suffering." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "And we have come to help." The words sent a ripple through the gathered humans. Help. These beings of light and power had descended from the heavens to offer help. It seemed too vast to believe, too good to be real. Yet they stood before them, solid and present, speaking promises that rang with authenticity. Azazel stepped forward to join Semjaza. His form was different, taller, more angular, with eyes that seemed to burn with particular intensity. "You live in darkness," he said, "not because you are meant to, but because no one has shown you the light. You struggle with tools that break and weapons that fail. You plant crops without understanding the patterns of seasons. You gaze at stars without knowing what they tell you." Another watcher spoke, his voice gentler but no less powerful. "We have knowledge that could ease your burdens, understanding that could prevent your suffering, wisdom that could elevate your existence beyond what you have imagined." The humans listened, torn between caution and hope. These beings spoke of gifts beyond comprehension, knowledge that could transform their lives, wisdom that could end their struggles. But there were questions. An elder among the humans, weathered by years and experience, voiced what others were thinking. "Why now? Why have you come when you never came before? Why offer help when you have only watched?" It was the right question, the necessary question, but it was also the question the watchers had already answered for themselves, through rationalizations and justifications they believed were true. Semjaza responded with conviction. "We have watched you long enough. We have seen your potential wasted, your gifts undeveloped. The time for observation has passed. The time for teaching. G has come." He gestured to the others standing behind him. "We are 200, and we have descended together. Each of us carries knowledge that can benefit your kind. We will teach you the secrets of the heavens and the mysteries of the earth. We will show you how to harness forces you have only wondered about. We will guide you toward greatness." The promise hung in the air, glittering with possibility. The humans looked at one another, uncertainty giving way to growing excitement. Beings of light were offering to teach them. Divine knowledge was being extended to mortal hands. How could this be anything but a blessing? They did not know what the Watchers did not know. They could not see what the angels refused to see. They did not understand that some gifts are curses in disguise, that some knowledge destroys rather than builds, that some teaching leads not to enlightenment but to devastation. The humans saw only the promise. The Watchers saw only their mercy. Neither saw the consequence that would follow. The first human stepped forward, drawn by curiosity and hope. Then another. Then more, until a crowd had gathered around the Watchers, eager to hear, ready to learn, hungry for the knowledge that was about to be poured into unprepared vessels. The teaching was about to begin. The first lessons were exchanged under a sky still trembling from the descent. Azazel began. He had watched humanity struggle with stone and wood, had seen them chip flint into crude blades that dulled with use, had witnessed their frustration as tools broke and weapons failed. He carried within him knowledge of something transformative, the secret of metal. He led a group of humans to a place where certain rocks lay exposed, different from ordinary stone. He showed them how to recognize ore, how to distinguish between common rock and that which held hidden potential. He taught them to build fires hotter than any they had made before, fires that could transform solid stone into liquid that flowed like water. The humans watched in awe as metal emerged from flame, as something hard became soft, as the impossible became real before their eyes. Azazel showed them how to shape the molten substance, how to pour it into forms, how to let it cool into tools sharper and stronger than anything they had possessed. Swords that could cut through bone, shields that could turn aside blows that would have shattered wood, armor that could protect the body from weapons that once meant certain death. The knowledge poured forth, and humanity received it with wonder and gratitude. But Azazel did not stop with weapons. He taught them other things. He showed them how to craft ornaments from precious metals, how to create adornments that caught light and drew attention. He taught the art of cosmetics, how to paint faces, how to darken eyes, how to create beauty through deception rather than natural grace. What seemed harmless carried seeds of vanity. What appeared innocent planted roots of pride. Other Watchers taught their own secrets. Barakiel revealed the movements of stars, showing humans how celestial bodies traced patterns across the sky. He taught them to read these patterns, to predict seasons, to mark time by the heavens rather than simple observation of weather and crops. But he went further. He taught them astrology, the belief that stars controlled destiny, that human fate was written in the sky, that power could be gained by aligning oneself with celestial forces. He taught them to see omens in every configuration, to fear eclipses, to worship what should have been merely observed. Gabriel taught the interpretation of signs. He showed humans how to read meaning into natural events, the flight of birds, the appearance of clouds, the behavior of animals before storms. Knowledge that could have been useful became something else in human hands. Divination, the manipulation of signs to predict futures and control outcomes. Armaros taught enchantments. He revealed how certain words, spoken in certain ways, could affect the world around them, how combinations of sound and intention could manipulate forces invisible to the eye. What began as understanding became sorcery, the bending of reality to human will through means never intended for mortal use. Penemu taught writing. Of all the knowledge shared, this seemed the most innocent. The ability to record thoughts, to preserve knowledge across generations, to communicate across distance and time. But even this gift carried darkness. He taught not just the recording of truth, but the crafting of lies made permanent. The use of ink to deceive, to manipulate, to spread falsehood that would outlive its speaker. The teaching spread like wildfire. Each watcher found students eager to learn. Each lesson led to 10 more questions. Each answer opened doors to chambers of knowledge that had been sealed since creation. The humans absorbed everything. They learned quickly, their minds expanding to accommodate our standing they had never imagined possible. They saw their world transform almost overnight. What had taken generations to develop through trial and error was now handed to them fully formed, perfected, complete. They built forges that burned day and night. They crafted weapons that made warriors invincible and tools that made labor effortless. They gazed at stars and claimed to read the future. They spoke words of power and watched reality shift in response. They wrote down not just history but spells, not just wisdom but incantations. The watchers watched their students progress and felt satisfaction. They believed they had done well. They had brought light to darkness, knowledge to ignorance, power to weakness. They had elevated humanity beyond its previous limitations. They had helped. But they did not see what was already beginning to change. The first sword forged for defense was soon lifted in conquest. The first knowledge of metal that could have been used to create better plows was instead used to craft better weapons. The knowledge of cosmetics that could have remained simple adornment became tools of seduction and manipulation. The understanding of stars that could have marked seasons became obsession with fate and fortune. Humanity had not been ready. The watchers had not understood. The knowledge that flowed so freely from immortal beings into mortal minds was too much, too fast, too powerful for vessels not designed to hold it. The earth had shifted. The boundary between heaven and earth, already torn by the descent, now gaped open. The teaching had begun, and with it, the unraveling of divine order. The balance that had existed since creation was broken. The simplicity that had protected humanity was shattered. The watchers stood among the humans they had come to help, surrounded by grateful students, praised as saviors and benefactors. They felt vindicated. They believed their compassion had been proven right, their mercy justified, their choice validated by the joy of those they taught. They did not yet see the corruption spreading beneath the surface. They did not recognize the seeds of destruction they had planted. They did not understand that teaching can be sin, that mercy can be transgression, that love without wisdom becomes the cruelest thing of all. The veil had been torn, the knowledge had been given, the teaching that heaven regretted had begun. And there was no way to take it back. The earth would never be the same. Humanity would never return to innocence. And the watchers, who had descended in what they believed was love, had unleashed consequences that would echo through every generation yet to come. The descent was complete, the teaching had begun, and creation itself trembled beneath the weight of what had been done. The watchers did not teach in whispers. They did not hide their instruction in shadows or conceal their gifts behind coded language. They taught openly, freely, without restraint. What heaven had guarded in silence, they revealed with proclamation. What had been sealed away from mortal understanding, they poured forth like water from a broken dam. The knowledge flowed, and humanity drank deeply. Azazel stood at the center of the transformation. He had watched humanity struggle with stone tools that chipped and broke, with wooden implements that splintered and failed. He had seen their frustration, their limitation, their need. And he possessed the solution, knowledge of metal, the hidden art that could change everything. He led groups of humans to places where certain rocks lay exposed among ordinary stone. He taught them to recognize ore, to see potential where others saw only burden. He showed them how to build furnaces that burned hotter than any fire they had kindled before, structures that could contain heat intense enough to transform solid matter into liquid. The humans watched in wonder as rocks melted, as stone became fluid, as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. Azazel taught them to extract the metal, to pour it into molds, to shape it while hot, and let it harden into forms stronger than anything nature had provided. He taught the forging of swords, blades that could pierce leather and flesh with minimal effort, weapons that held their edge through battle after battle, that did not shatter against bone or dull against armor. He showed them how to craft knives of every size and purpose, for cutting, for skinning, for killing. He revealed the secrets of defensive armor, shields that could turn aside blows that would have crushed wood, breastplates that protected the heart and lungs from arrows and spears, chain mail that covered the body in metal rings, flexible yet nearly impenetrable. The knowledge of warfare transformed overnight. What had been simple conflicts resolved with clubs and stones became organized violence executed with lethal precision. The humans learned to kill more efficiently. They learned to protect themselves while destroying others. They learned that power came not from strength alone, but from superior tools wielded with skill. But Azazel did not stop with weapons. He taught them the working of precious metals, gold and silver extracted from earth and shaped into ornaments. He showed them how to craft bracelets and necklaces, rings and crowns, objects of beauty that served no purpose beyond display. He revealed the art of setting stones, how to cut gems and mount them in metal, how to create jewelry that caught light and drew the eye. He taught cosmetics, the use of antimony to darken eyelids, to make eyes appear larger and more alluring, the application of colored tinctures to paint faces, to enhance beauty or create it where nature had not provided, the art of deception through appearance, making oneself seem more than what one was. Women learned to adorn themselves not for simple beauty but for seduction. Men learned to display wealth and status through ornaments that proclaimed power. What had been humble became proud. What had been simple became complex. What had been natural became artificial. The teaching of Azazel planted seeds of vanity that would grow into forests of corruption. Humanity learned to value appearance over substance, decoration over function, display over authenticity. They learned that beauty could be manufactured, that attraction could be manipulated, that faces could become masks hiding truth beneath carefully applied lies. While Azazel taught the arts of war and vanity, Semjaza revealed different secrets, knowledge of enchantments and the cutting of roots. He showed humans which plants held power beyond nutrition, which roots, when cut in certain ways and combined with specific words, could affect the mind and body in ways that seemed magical. He taught the crafting of philters, potions that could inspire desire, induce sleep, or bring visions that revealed hidden things. This was sorcery disguised as medicine, knowledge of the natural world twisted toward manipulation and control. Semjaza taught humans to bend plants to purposes they were never meant to serve, to extract properties that could alter consciousness and compel will. He revealed enchantments, specific combinations of words and intention that could influence outcomes, that could call upon forces beyond human understanding to intervene in mortal affairs. He taught spells that seemed to work, that produced results, that gave humans a sense of power over the unseen realm. Other watchers taught their own forbidden knowledge, each contributing to the transformation of humanity from simple to complex, from innocent to knowing, from humble to arrogant. Barakiel stepped forward with knowledge of the stars. He had watched humans gaze upward in wonder, seeing points of light without understanding what they witnessed. He taught them astronomy, the true movements of celestial bodies, the patterns they traced across the void, the cycles that repeated with perfect precision. He showed them how to mark time by the heavens, how to predict seasons by the position of constellations, how to navigate by stars that held their places while the world turned beneath them. This knowledge, in itself, could have been gift without curse. Understanding the cosmos could have elevated humanity without corrupting them. But Barakiel went further. He taught astrology, the belief that stars controlled human destiny, that celestial movements determined earthly outcomes. He taught them to read fate in the configurations of planets, to see omens in the alignment of heavenly bodies, to believe their lives were written in patterns beyond their control. Humans learned to fear eclipses as signs of coming disaster. They learned to consult the stars before making decisions, surrendering their will to forces they believed governed their existence. They learned that some days were fortunate and others cursed, that birth under certain signs carried meaning, that the heavens spoke messages that must be heeded. What began as understanding became superstition. What started as knowledge became bondage. Humanity, given freedom to choose their path, now believed their choices were predetermined by stars they could not influence. Gabriel revealed the reading of signs and omens. He taught humans to see meaning in everything, the flight patterns of birds, the shapes of clouds, the behavior of animals before storms. He showed them how to interpret natural events as messages from the divine or warnings of coming catastrophe. Every unusual occurrence became significant. Every deviation from normal patterns carried weight. Humans learned to live in constant interpretation, reading meaning into events that were simply part of the natural world's complexity. This knowledge bred anxiety. It created a population that could not experience life simply, that saw portent in every shadow and prophecy, in every unusual sight. They became slaves to signs, dependent on interpretation, unable to move forward without consulting omens that told them whether their path was blessed or cursed. Armaros taught the resolution of enchantments, how to break spells, how to counter sorcery, how to defend against magical attacks. On the surface, this seemed helpful. If humanity was learning dark arts from other watchers, should they not also learn protection? But the teaching of defense required teaching the nature of offense. To understand how to break an enchantment, one must understand how enchantments work. To counter sorcery, one must learn sorcery. Armaros's gift was not protection but deeper immersion in arts that should never have been revealed. Penemu taught writing, the preservation of knowledge through symbols marked on stone and clay. Of all the gifts, this seemed most innocent. The ability to record thoughts, to pass wisdom across generations without relying on memory alone, to communicate across distance and time. But Penemu taught not just the recording of truth. He taught the crafting of lies made permanent. He showed humans how ink and parchment could preserve falsehood as easily as fact, how written words carried authority regardless of their accuracy, how documentation could deceive more effectively than spoken lies because it appeared more permanent, more trustworthy. Humanity learned to forge documents, to create false records, to rewrite history according to their preferences rather than truth. They learned that words, once written, took on power independent of their veracity. They learned that control of written knowledge meant control of perceived reality. Gabriel taught the making of weapons specifically designed for death, instruments whose only purpose was to kill. Not tools that could defend or hunt, but implements crafted solely for the destruction of human life. He revealed techniques of assassination, methods of creating weapons that could be concealed, poisons that could kill without leaving obvious trace. Uriel taught the courses of the moon, showing humans how lunar cycles affected tides and fertility, how certain phases amplified or diminished natural forces. This knowledge, like so much of what was taught, began as useful information but quickly transformed into obsession. Humans began to plan their lives around lunar phases, to attribute power to the moon beyond what was real, to worship the celestial body rather than simply understanding its influence. The teaching continued, spreading like disease through human populations. Each watcher found eager students. Each lesson spawned 10 more questions. Each answer opened doors to chambers of knowledge that had been sealed since creation for good reason. Humanity learned quickly, too quickly. Their minds, crafted for simpler understanding, expanded rapidly to accommodate knowledge they were never designed to hold. What should have taken millennia of gradual development was compressed into a single generation of intense instruction. They learned to kill with efficiency that would have horrified their ancestors. They learned to manipulate appearance to deceive the eye. They learned to read stars as if celestial bodies cared about human affairs. They learned to manipulate plants and words and natural forces toward ends that violated the design of creation. What had been simple became complex. Villages that once operated on trust now operated on contracts written in the new language Penemu had taught. Conflicts that once ended in bruised pride now ended in blood spilled by weapons Azazel had revealed. Relationships that once formed naturally now depended on cosmetics and enchantments designed to manipulate affection. What had been humble became arrogant. Humans who once approached life with appropriate awareness of their limitations now believed they could control outcomes through sorcery and divination. They who once accepted the mysteries of existence now claimed to read the future and bend reality to their will. Each teaching carried a shadow. Each gift carried a curse hidden within what appeared to be blessing. The knowledge of metalworking, which could have been used solely for tools that eased labor and improved life, instead became primarily the domain of weapons. The first forges burned brightest not for plowshares but for swords. The finest craftsmen dedicated their skills not to implements of peace, but to instruments of war. Cities began to arm themselves. Leaders who possessed superior weapons conquered those who did not. Warfare, once limited by the fragility of wooden clubs and stone axes, now escalated into organized campaigns of destruction. Armies formed, equipped with metal armor and blades that could cut through flesh like wheat before the scythe. The knowledge that was meant to help became the knowledge that destroyed. And once humanity learned to kill efficiently, they could not unlearn it. The technique spread from city to city, from generation to generation, becoming embedded in human civilization as deeply as language itself. The cosmetics that Azazel taught seemed harmless, mere decoration, simple vanity, but they planted seeds that grew into forests of deception. Women learned that natural beauty was insufficient, that they must enhance and alter their appearance to be valued. Men learned to judge by surfaces rather than substance, to prize artificial beauty over authentic character. Relationships that once formed through genuine connection now began with calculated display. Attraction became manipulation. Love became transaction. The face humanity showed the world was no longer the face they possessed, but the face they constructed through arts designed to deceive. The astrology that Barakiel revealed robbed humanity of something precious, the sense of agency over their own lives. When humans believed their destinies were written in stars, they surrendered responsibility for their choices. They blamed celestial configurations for their failures and credited the heavens for their successes. This knowledge bred passivity disguised as wisdom. Humans consulted the stars before making decisions, waiting for favorable alignments rather than acting with courage and conviction. They lived not as free beings shaping their own paths, but as subjects of cosmic forces they believed controlled their fate. The divination and omens that Cockabeel taught created populations that could not rest. Every bird that flew across their path carried meaning. Every unusual cloud formation signaled coming change. Every dream required interpretation. Every moment demanded vigilance for signs that might reveal hidden truth or warn of approaching danger. Humanity became enslaved to interpretation, unable to experience life directly without filtering it through layers of symbolic meaning. They lost the ability to accept mystery, to live with uncertainty, to move forward without needing to know what every sign portended. The enchantments and root cutting that Semjaza revealed opened doors to manipulation of forces beyond human comprehension. Humans learned to craft potions that altered consciousness, to speak words that seemed to bend reality, to manipulate the unseen in ways that violated the natural order. Sorcery spread like wildfire. Every village developed practitioners who claimed special knowledge, who offered services that promised control over outcomes no mortal should control. Love potions that compelled affection, curses that brought illness to enemies, rituals that claimed to summon forces from beyond the veil. The boundary between what was real and what was manipulation blurred. Humans lost their grounding in the natural world, believing instead that reality could be reshaped according to will and word and carefully crafted ritual. The writing that Penemu taught served not just truth but lies, not just wisdom but deception. Documents were forged to claim false ownership. Histories were rewritten to favor those in power. Sacred texts were altered to support teachings that served human ambition rather than divine truth. Knowledge that should have been liberating became another tool of control. Those who could read and write gained power over those who could not. Information became commodity to be hoarded, manipulated, and weaponized. The Watchers stood among their students and saw progress. They saw cities growing more sophisticated. They saw humans wielding power they had never possessed. They saw civilization advancing at rates that seemed impossible just years before. They believed they had succeeded. They believed their mercy had been vindicated. They believed the knowledge they shared was elevating humanity toward something greater. But they were blind to what was actually happening. Humanity was not rising. They were reaching beyond their design, straining toward heights they were never meant to achieve. And when creatures reach beyond what they are meant to hold, they do not ascend, they fall. The simplicity that had protected them was gone. The innocence that had allowed them to live in peace was shattered. The boundaries that had preserved them in their proper place were broken beyond repair. Humanity learned to kill with weapons heaven had never intended them to wield. They learned to deceive with faces painted to hide their true selves. They learned to manipulate the unseen through sorcery that violated the order of creation. They learned to surrender their will to stars and omens rather than living with courage and faith. What had been humble became arrogant. What had been simple became twisted. What had been pure became corrupted. The teaching continued, spreading to every corner of the earth. Each lesson led to more questions. Each answer opened new chambers of forbidden knowledge. The Watchers poured forth everything they knew, believing their generosity was love, their instruction was mercy, their gifts were blessings. They did not see, or refused to see, that they were destroying what they claimed to help. The knowledge given without wisdom became curse. The gifts offered without restraint became poison. The teaching that heaven had guarded in silence for good reason was now loose in the world, transforming humanity in ways that could never be undone. Each art revealed carried darkness within it. Each secret shared planted seeds of corruption. Each lesson taught pushed humanity further from their design and closer to catastrophe. The Watchers believed they were elevating humanity. They believed they were sharing light. They believed their compassion justified their transgression. But they were teaching creatures of dust to grasp at things meant only for beings of light. They were pouring infinity into finite vessels. They were giving knowledge to those who lacked the wisdom to wield it safely. And the earth groaned beneath the weight of what was being done. The natural order bent and buckled. The sacred architecture of creation sustained wound after wound as forbidden knowledge spread like infection through human civilization. The teaching that heaven regretted had been given. The knowledge that should have remained hidden was now common. The arts that corrupted more than they elevated were now embedded in human understanding, impossible to extract, impossible to forget. The fall had begun. Not just the fall of angels who descended against divine command, but the fall of humanity itself, creatures reaching beyond their design, grasping at knowledge they were never meant to hold, learning arts that would lead them not to greatness but to destruction. The forbidden knowledge had been revealed, and there was no way to seal it again. Knowledge spread like fire across the earth. What began in a single location, with a handful of eager students gathered around the Watchers, soon multiplied beyond control. Those who learned taught others. Those who received the secrets shared them freely. Within a single generation, the world transformed. The change was not gradual. It was not a slow evolution from one state to another. It was rapid, catastrophic, complete. The earth that had existed before the descent, simple, ordered, innocent, vanished. In its place emerged something twisted, something broken, something corrupted beyond recognition. Cities grew violent almost overnight. Communities that had once resolved disputes through counsel and compromise now settled differences with weapons forged in the fires Azazel had taught them to build. The swords that gleamed in forges were not stored as last resorts. They were drawn at the slightest provocation, wielded by men who had discovered that power came not from wisdom or character, but from superior arms and willingness to use them. Wars erupted with newfound brutality. What had once been skirmishes between neighboring villages, brief conflicts resolved quickly with minimal loss, became organized campaigns of conquest and destruction. Armies formed, equipped with metal armor that turned aside stone and wood, armed with blades that could cut through flesh and bone with terrible ease. The knowledge of warfare that the Watchers had shared was not used for defense alone. It was used for expansion, for domination, for the satisfaction of ambitions that had not existed before but now consumed those who harbored them. Leaders looked at neighboring lands and saw not fellow humans but resources to be taken, territories to be claimed, populations to be subjugated. Blood soaked the soil in quantities the earth had never known. Battlefields became common features of the landscape, places where the ground turned red and stayed that way, where bodies lay in heaps, where crows gathered in numbers too vast to count. The violence was not occasional. It was constant. Humanity had learned to kill efficiently, and they practiced their new skills with enthusiasm that would have horrified their ancestors. The secrets of the stars, which Raphael had revealed with the intention of helping humanity understand the cosmos, were twisted into omens of greed and control. Astrology became not a tool for marking seasons, but a weapon for manipulating the fearful and the superstitious. Those who claimed to read the heavens gained power over those who could not. They declared certain days auspicious for battle, others cursed for travel. They proclaimed that kings would rise or fall based on planetary alignments, that harvests would succeed or fail according to celestial configurations. They used the knowledge not to enlighten, but to control, to instill fear, to maintain authority over populations rendered helpless by belief in forces beyond their control. The knowledge of plants that Semjaza had taught, the cutting of roots, the crafting of potions, the manipulation of natural substances, became tools of poison and murder. What could have been medicine became weapon. Healers who should have used their knowledge to ease suffering instead sold their skills to those who wanted enemies eliminated without open violence. Sorcery spread through communities like infection. Every village developed practitioners who claimed power over the unseen, who offered services that promised results no natural means could achieve. Love potions that enslaved the will, curses that brought wasting sickness, enchantments that promised protection but delivered only deeper entanglement in forces humanity was never meant to manipulate. The air itself felt poisoned, not with visible smoke or tangible pollution, but with something deeper, a spiritual corruption that hung over the earth like a shroud. Those sensitive to such things felt it constantly, a pressure in the chest, a weight on the soul, a sense that something fundamental had broken and could not be repaired. Beauty, which had once been simple appreciation of what was naturally lovely, became vanity. The cosmetics Azazel taught transformed appearance into obsession. Women spent hours painting their faces, not for joy but for competition, for the gaining of advantage, for the manipulation of desire. Men judged worth by surface adornment rather than character. Relationships formed not through genuine connection but through calculated display designed to deceive. Strength, which had once meant the ability to endure hardship and protect the weak, became cruelty. Those who possessed physical power used it not to serve but to dominate. The strong preyed upon the weak without restraint. Might became the only right that mattered. Men who once lived simply, tending fields, raising families, finding contentment in daily labor and seasonal rhythms, now craved power, wealth, and dominion over others. The Nold. The Watchers had shared awakened appetites that had lain dormant. Ambition that had been held in check by limited means now had tools to achieve what had previously been impossible. They hoarded resources. They accumulated wealth not for security but for display. They built fortifications not merely for protection but as declarations of superiority. They sought control over other humans, viewing their fellow creatures not as equals but as means to greater ends, labor to be exploited, populations to be ruled, subordinates to serve the will of those who had grasped power first and held it most ruthlessly. The simplicity that had characterized human existence vanished. Life became complex, layered with hierarchies and systems of control that had not existed before. Society stratified rapidly into rulers and ruled, wealthy and poor, powerful and powerless. Those at the top used the knowledge they possessed, of metals, of warfare, of manipulation, to ensure they remained there. Those at the bottom found themselves trapped in positions they could not escape. Women were taught seduction as a weapon. The arts that Azazel revealed, the painting of faces, the enhancement of eyes, the crafting of beauty through artificial means, became tools not of simple adornment but of strategic manipulation. Women learned that appearance could be wielded to gain advantage, to secure favor, to extract resources from men made vulnerable by desire. Relationships became transactions. Love became commodity. What should have been sacred union between equals became battlefield where each party maneuvered for position. Trust eroded as deception became normalized. Marriages were arranged not for companionship but for alliance, for the joining of wealth, for the securing of political advantage. The teaching corrupted not just individuals but the very concept of human connection. When every interaction became calculation, when every relationship involved hidden motives, when every display of affection might be manipulation, the bonds that held communities together began to dissolve. Children grew up in a world where innocence had been replaced by cunning. They learned from the earliest age that survival required shrewdness, that success demanded calculation, that virtue was weakness and deception was strength. The elders who tried to teach the old ways, honesty, simplicity, trust, found their words falling on ears that could not hear them. The children looked at the world around them and learned what it rewarded. And what it rewarded was not goodness but cleverness, not integrity but ruthlessness, not love but power. A generation arose that had never known the world before the Watchers descended. To them, the corruption was normal. The violence was expected. The manipulation was simply how things worked. They could not mourn what they had never experienced. They could not long for innocence they had never possessed. The earth itself groaned beneath the weight of corruption. This was not metaphor. The natural world responded to what was happening among humans. The balance that had existed since creation, the harmony between humanity and the rest of creation, shattered. Animals fled from human settlements, driven away by the violence and the sorcery, by the presence of forces that should never have been unleashed in the mortal realm. Fields that once produced abundant harvests began to fail, as if the soil itself rejected what humanity had become. Rivers ran red not with minerals, but with blood from battles fought along their banks. The sky seemed darker, though the sun burned as bright as ever. Something in the quality of light had changed, as if creation itself mourned what had been lost. The natural order bent under pressure it was never designed to withstand. The knowledge the Watchers shared was not merely information. It was power that distorted the fabric of reality. Sorcery opened doorways between realms that should have remained sealed. Divination reached into spaces beyond mortal perception, pulling at threads that held the universe in its proper pattern. The crafting of metals from earth and fire released substances that changed the balance of elements. Creation groaned, and the few who still retained sensitivity to such things heard it. A low frequency that resonated in the bones, a vibration that spoke of something fundamental breaking apart. Blood soaked the soil in such quantities that in some places the earth would not absorb it. It pooled on the surface, attracting swarms of insects, spreading disease, creating an odor of death that hung over entire regions. The violence was not contained to battlefields. It spilled into homes, into streets, into places that should have been sanctuaries. Murder became common. Life became cheap. The sanctity that had once protected human existence evaporated. Sorcery poisoned the air with influences that could not be seen but were nonetheless real. The constant practice of enchantments, the emmoning of forces from beyond the veil, the manipulation of natural substances toward unnatural ends, all of this created spiritual pollution that affected everyone who breathed it. People felt it as constant unease, as nightmares that plagued their sleep, as the sense that they were being watched by things that had no eyes, followed by presences that cast no shadows. The natural order broke under pressure it could no longer sustain. Seasons became unpredictable. Rain fell when it should have been dry. Drought struck when water should have been abundant. Animals behaved strangely, appearing in places they had never been seen, acting in ways that violated their nature. The reliable patterns that humanity had depended upon since their creation became unreliable. The consequences of the teaching became undeniable. What the Watchers had imagined would be a gift had become a plague. What they believed would be enlightenment had become enslavement. Humanity was not elevated by the knowledge they received. They were burdened by it. They were crushed beneath weight they were never designed to carry. The forbidden arts that spread across the earth did not make humans more like angels. They made humans into something worse than they had been, creatures with mortal limitations wielding power meant only for immortal beings, operating without the wisdom necessary to use it safely. The Watchers had not foreseen this. They had imagined gratitude. They had expected humanity to receive their teaching with joy and use it to build better lives, to create more just societies, to reduce suffering and increase flourishing. They had believed their knowledge would liberate, that their instruction would elevate, that their mercy would be vindicated by the results. Instead, they witnessed decay. They saw the weapons they taught humans to forge, turned not against wild beasts or used for legitimate defense, but against other humans in wars of conquest and greed. They saw the cosmetics they revealed used not for simple beauty, but for manipulation and deception. They saw the knowledge of stars twisted into superstition that enslaved rather than freed. They saw the understanding of plants corrupted into poisons that killed rather than healed. They saw humanity growing more violent, more cunning, more corrupt with each passing year. They saw innocence disappearing from human eyes, replaced by calculation and suspicion. They saw communities that had once functioned through trust now operating through contracts enforced by threat of violence. They saw children losing their childhood to the harsh realities of a world that had become brutal beyond measure. The Watchers stood among their students and saw the consequences of their choice. Some among them felt the first stirrings of regret. They had not intended this. They had wanted to help. They had believed their compassion justified their transgression, but the evidence before their eyes could not be denied. Yet still they did not stop. This was perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. Even as they witnessed the corruption spreading, even as they saw the gift becoming curse, even as they understood that they had unleashed devastation rather than blessing, they continued to teach. Some continued because they did not know what else to do. Others continued because they convinced themselves that more knowledge would solve the problems the first knowledge had created. Still others continued because they could not face the weight of what they had done, could not acknowledge that their mercy had been mistake, their compassion had been pride. They could not undo what had been done. This reality settled over them like a shroud. The knowledge they had shared could not be unshared. The secrets they had revealed could not be hidden again. The teaching they had given could not be taken back. Humanity now possessed understanding they would never surrender. Those who learned the forging of metal would not return to stone. Those who learned the reading of stars would not forget what the heavens appeared to tell them. Those who learned sorcery would not abandon the power they believed it gave them. The knowledge was loose in the world, spreading from teacher to student, from parent to child, from city to city across the breadth of the earth. It would never be contained again. The veil had been torn, and no force short of complete destruction could restore it. The earth continued to transform. Villages became cities. Cities became kingdoms. Kingdoms went to war with one another using weapons and strategies the Watchers had taught. The innocent world that had existed before the descent was gone, replaced by something darker, something twisted, something that bore the mark of knowledge given without wisdom, power granted without restraint, teaching offered without understanding the full weight of consequence. The Watchers looked upon what their mercy had wrought, and some began to understand, dimly the whist. They had rejected. They began to grasp why heaven had maintained the boundary, why knowledge had been withheld, why the separation between realms had been necessary. They began to see that protection masquerading as restriction had actually been mercy, that the limits they had considered cruel had actually been kind. But understanding came too late. The deed was done. The teaching had been given. The corruption had spread beyond any hope of containment. The earth groaned beneath the weight of what humanity had become. Blood and sorcery and violence had transformed the world into something unrecognizable. The natural order that had sustained creation since its beginning was breaking apart. The balance was lost. The harmony was shattered. And still the knowledge spread. Still humans learned new ways to kill, new methods of manipulation, new techniques for bending reality to their will. Still they reached beyond their design, grasping at power they were never meant to hold, wielding forces they could not control. The gift had become plague. The enlightenment had become enslavement. The teaching that heaven regretted giving had corrupted the earth so thoroughly that nothing short of complete cleansing could restore what had been lost. The watchers stood among the ruins of their good intentions. They had descended in love and unleashed devastation. They had taught in mercy and created corruption. They had crossed the boundary believing they knew better than heaven's design, and they had proven beyond any doubt that they did not. The earth was broken. Humanity was corrupted. The knowledge was loose and could never be sealed again. The consequences of their choice rippled outward, touching everything, poisoning everything, transforming everything into something darker than what had existed before. And there was no way back, no path to restoration, no means of undoing what had been done. The teaching had been given, the corruption had spread. The world would never be the same. The fall was complete, and the earth groaned beneath the weight of knowledge it was never meant to bear. The watchers did not remain distant teachers. Teaching alone was not enough to satisfy what had grown within them. Observation had turned to affection. Affection had turned to desire, and desire, once awakened, demanded fulfillment. They looked upon the daughters of men and saw beauty that stirred something within their immortal beings. These were not the radiant forms of angelic existence. These were creatures of flesh and blood, mortal and fragile, yet possessing a quality that drew the watchers with irresistible force. The women moved through life with grace born from limitation, with beauty that would fade but was therefore all the more precious in its brief flowering. The watchers convinced themselves this too was mercy. They had descended to help humanity. Why should they not join themselves more fully to those they had come to elevate? Why should they remain separate when union seemed the natural extension of the compassion that had brought them down from heaven? They took human women as wives. This was not courtship as humans practiced it. This was not the slow building of relationship through shared experience and growing affection. The watchers saw. The watchers desired. The watchers took. Their power gave them access. Their presence commanded attention. The women they chose had little capacity to refuse beings who radiated authority and glory beyond anything mortal men could offer. Some women came willingly, drawn by the magnificence of these beings who had descended from realms beyond imagination. Others came because refusal seemed impossible. Still others were simply taken, their consent neither sought nor considered necessary. The unions violated another sacred boundary. The separation between realms was not merely about knowledge. It extended to the very essence of being. Angels were not meant to join with humans. Immortal was not meant to mingle with mortal. Spirit fashioned from light was not meant to merge with flesh formed from dust. The boundaries existed for reason. They preserved the integrity of each realm. They maintained the order that allowed both to function according to their design. When the watchers crossed the line that separated observation from involvement, they had torn the veil. When they crossed the line that separated teaching from union, they shattered creation itself. From these forbidden unions came children. The offspring were neither fully angelic nor fully human. They were something between, something new, something that should never have existed. The ancient texts would call them Nephilim, the fallen ones, the giants, the offspring of transgression. They emerged from the womb unlike any child humanity had seen. Even as infants, they were larger than normal babies, stronger, more demanding. They grew at rates that defied natural law. A child of 6 months had the size and strength of a child of 3 years. A youth of 10 possessed the stature of a grown man. But they did not stop growing when ordinary humans reached their full height. They continued, towering over mortal men and women, reaching proportions that made them seem like beings from another world. Some accounts would claim they grew to impossible heights, 300 cubits, towering like walking mountains. Whether literal or symbolic, the descriptions captured a truth. These were creatures whose very existence dwarfed ordinary humanity. The Nephilim were giants not just in body but in appetite. They possessed strength beyond mortal limits and hungers that could not be satisfied by normal means. They required food in quantities that strained human capacity to provide. They consumed without restraint, without consideration for those around them, without awareness that resources had limits. At first they ate what humans offered, meat from animals, grain from harvests, fruits from orchards. But the amounts they required were staggering. A single Nephilim could consume in a day what would feed a family for a week. Communities strained to provide for these beings who had appeared among them, offspring of the unions between watchers and human women. The Earth's resources, abundant for normal human populations, buckled under the demand. The Nephilim devoured animals faster than they could reproduce. They consumed crops before new harvests could be planted. They drank water sources dry. They took without giving, consumed without replenishing, demanded without considering consequences. When ordinary food sources became insufficient, the Nephilim turned to more desperate measures. They began consuming animals that humans considered unclean, creatures that were never meant for food. They devoured beasts of burden, leaving communities without means to plow fields or transport goods. They slaughtered livestock meant for breeding, destroying future food supplies in their insatiable hunger. Then the Nephilim turned upon humanity itself. The ancient texts preserve the horror in stark language. When the resources of the earth proved insufficient, when all the animals had been consumed and the fields stripped bare, the giants began to devour the children of men. What had been hunger became predation. What had been consumption became cannibalism. Humanity, which had welcomed the Watchers as teachers and benefactors, now found themselves prey to the offspring those unions had produced. The Nephilim saw humans not as kin, despite sharing half their nature, but as resources to be exploited, as food to satisfy appetites that could not be controlled. Terror spread across the earth. Communities that had survived wars and violence now faced a different threat, beings of immense strength and insatiable hunger who viewed humans as cattle. Parents hid their children. Villages built walls not against human enemies, but against the giants who roamed the land, taking what they wanted, consuming what they found. The Nephilim became tyrants. Their strength made them undefeatable by ordinary means. Their size made them intimidating beyond measure. Their appetites made them ruthless in their pursuit of sustenance. They ruled through fear and violence, establishing dominion over regions where no human could challenge them. They took what they desired without asking. They destroyed what displeased them without consequence. They killed without restraint, viewing human life as expendable, human resistance as irrelevant. Communities that once governed themselves through councils and mutual agreement now existed under the shadow of giants who could crush any opposition with casual violence. The Nephilim spread chaos wherever they walked. Their presence destabilized entire regions. Agriculture collapsed under their consumption. Trade routes became impassable because no one dared travel where giants roamed. Communities that had thrived for generations emptied as populations fled, seeking safety in remote places where the giants had not yet reached. Some among the Nephilim developed capacities beyond mere physical strength. Born from the union of angelic and human nature, they possessed abilities that transcended normal human limits. Some displayed knowledge beyond what they should have possessed at their age, as if they inherited fragments of angelic understanding through their Watcher fathers. Others manifested powers that seemed supernatural, strength that exceeded even their enormous size, endurance that defied explanation, abilities that suggested they carried within them traces of their father's immortal nature. They were living evidence of the transgression. Every giant that walked the earth proclaimed the broken boundary between heaven and earth. Every Nephilim that towered over ordinary humans testified to the violation of sacred order. Their very existence was proof that the Watchers had not merely taught forbidden knowledge. They had crossed lines that should never have been crossed, mingled essences that should never have been joined, created life that should never have been born. The earth could not sustain them. The natural world operated according to patterns established at creation, balances carefully maintained to support the life that existed within it. The Nephilim violated these balances. They consumed beyond what the earth could replenish. They demanded resources at rates that collapsed entire ecosystems. They existed outside the natural order, disrupting cycles that had functioned perfectly until their arrival. Famine spread in their wake. Regions the giants passed through became wastelands, stripped of everything edible, depopulated of everything living. The land itself seemed to reject them, as if creation recognized their presence as violation. Fields where Nephilim walked produced diminished harvests. Waters they drank from became fouled. The earth groaned beneath their weight, both literal and spiritual. Their existence was an abomination, not because they chose evil, though many did commit acts of horrific violence, not because they were inherently wicked, though their appetites led to destruction. They were an abomination because they were never meant to exist at all. Creation had been ordered with specific boundaries. Kinds produced after their own kind. Angelic remained angelic. Human remained human. The lines that separated different forms of existence were not arbitrary restrictions but essential structures that allowed creation to function. When those lines were crossed, when essences that were meant to remain separate were merged, the result was not a new form of life but a corruption of the order itself. The Nephilim were not a new species. They were a violation, not a development or evolution but a breaking of fundamental law. Their bodies were contradictions, mortal flesh animated by something that carried traces of immortality, human limitations combined with fragments of angelic power. They did not fit within creation's design. They were anomalies that strained the fabric of reality simply be. Why existing? Heaven looked down and saw not progress but corruption. The archangels who had maintained their posts, who had not descended, who had remained faithful to their appointed roles, witnessed what the Watchers had unleashed. They saw the giants consuming the earth. They saw humanity terrorized by creatures that should never have been born. They saw the natural order collapsing under the weight of beings that existed outside its design. The teaching had led to intermingling. The Watchers had not stopped at sharing forbidden knowledge. They had crossed the final boundary, joining themselves to human women, creating offspring that embodied the violation of every sacred separation. What began as compassion, or what they called compassion, had descended into corruption so complete that creation itself could no longer sustain it. The intermingling had led to monstrous offspring. The Nephilim were not merely large humans or unusually strong individuals. They were beings whose nature was fundamentally incompatible with the world they inhabited. Their existence created ripples of disruption that affected everything around them. The violence they committed was only the most visible manifestation of the deeper problem. They were creatures that violated the basic architecture of creation. Those offspring now threatened to destroy everything the Creator had made. If the Nephilim continued unchecked, if they multiplied and spread, if their consumption and violence proceeded without restraint, the earth would become uninhabitable, not just for humans but for all life. The giants' appetites would strip the world bare. Their violence would eliminate populations that could not defend themselves. Their very existence would continue corrupting the natural order until nothing remained but chaos and devastation. The horror of what had happened settled over those who still retained enough clarity to see it. This was not the elevation the Watchers had promised. This was not the mercy they had proclaimed. This was catastrophe, the natural consequence of crossing boundaries that existed not to restrict but to protect, not to limit but to sustain. The Nephilim walked the earth as living monuments to rebellion. Every step they took crushed ground that groaned beneath their weight. Every breath they drew consumed air that seemed thinner in their presence. Every moment they existed testified to the broken covenant between heaven and earth, to the shattered boundary that had once preserved both realms in their proper place. Some humans looked upon the giants and worshipped them, treating them as gods walking among mortals. These beings of impossible size and strength seemed divine to those who had never witnessed true divinity. They offered sacrifices to the Nephilim, hoping to appease their hunger. They served them as slaves, hoping to secure protection from their violence. They told stories that elevated the giants to legendary status, forgetting that legends often begin with tragedy mistaken for glory. Others recognized the Nephilim for what they were, abominations that heralded the end of the world they had known. These faithful few understood that beings born from transgression could produce nothing but further transgression. They saw that the giants' existence proved creation itself was breaking down, that the order established at the beginning was collapsing, that something fundamental had gone terribly wrong. The Watchers themselves looked upon their offspring with complicated emotions. Some felt pride. These powerful beings carried their essence, displayed strength and capabilities beyond ordinary humans. Others felt dawning horror as they witnessed what their children became, how their appetites grew insatiable, how their violence spread unchecked. Still others felt nothing, having descended so far into corruption that they could no longer recognize it for what it was. The earth could not sustain this state indefinitely. The Nephilim consumed resources faster than nature could replenish them. They disrupted balances that had maintained life since creation. They spread violence and chaos that made organized civilization increasingly impossible. They embodied a principle incompatible with ongoing existence, the principle that boundaries could be crossed without consequence, that sacred separations could be violated without cost, that the fundamental order of creation could be ignored when it proved inconvenient. Their presence proved otherwise. Every giant that stalked the land demonstrated that consequences were real, that boundaries existed for reason, that the order of creation was not optional but essential. The Nephilim were not evolution or progress. They were devolution and decay, living proof that when creatures reach beyond their design, when they grasp at what they were never meant to hold, the result is not ascension but corruption. Creation twisted beyond recognition groaned for relief that would not come through natural means. The situation had progressed beyond any solution humanity could provide. The giants could not be defeated by human weapons. They could not be reasoned with or reformed. They could not be integrated into the natural order because their very nature violated that order. Heaven looked down and saw the full scope of the catastrophe. The teaching the Watchers had provided corrupted human civilization. The unions the Watchers had pursued produced offspring that threatened all life. The mercy the Watchers proclaimed had unleashed devastation that would consume the earth if allowed to continue. The Nephilim walked as proof of broken boundaries, as evidence of violated covenant, as testimony to the wisdom heaven had shown in maintaining separation between realms. They were the offspring of rebellion, not rebels themselves by choice, but rebels by nature, born from transgression, embodying violation, existing as living contradiction to the order that sustained all things. And they multiplied. The Watchers continued their unions with human women. More giants were born. More appetites emerged that could not be satisfied. More violence spread that could not be contained. More corruption seeped into the fabric of existence, breaking down the structures that held creation together. The world the Creator had made, ordered, balanced, good, was disappearing beneath the weight of beings that were never meant to exist. The teaching had brought corruption. The intermingling had brought abomination, and the offspring of both now threatened to destroy everything, leaving in their wake nothing but chaos, violence, and the ruins of a world that had once been perfect but was now broken beyond mortal means to repair. Amid the violence and sorcery, amid the bloodshed and oppression, a sound rose from the earth. It was not a single voice. It was countless voices joined together in desperation, the cries of the innocent, the suffering, the ones crushed beneath the weight of forbidden knowledge and monstrous rule, the prayers of those who had no defender, the wails of those who watched their children devoured, the pleas of those who faced violence they could not resist and corruption they could not escape. The cry rose like smoke from a sacrifice, ascending through air thick with the spiritual pollution of sorcery and blood. It passed through the broken veil that had once separated heaven and earth, moving upward through layers of existence until it reached the gates of the heavenly realm. The earth itself joined the cry, not metaphorically, but as an actual participant in the appeal to heaven, the soil that had absorbed blood in quantities it was never meant to hold, the ground that bore the weight of giants who violated the natural order, the creation that groaned beneath corruption it could not sustain. The earth became a witness, an accuser, bringing complaint against those who had unleashed devastation upon it. The land petitioned heaven using language that echoed ancient appeals to rulers and kings. It cried out for relief, for justice, for intervention against lawlessness that threatened to consume everything. The earth and its human inhabitants shared the same suffering, exhibited the same response, a cry to heaven born from agony that could no longer be borne in silence. The archangels heard the cry. Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel stood at their posts in the heavenly realm, the four who had remained faithful when the watchers descended. They had witnessed the transgression from the beginning. They had seen the 200 descend from Mount Hermon. They had observed the teaching, the intermingling, the birth of the Nephilim. They had watched the corruption spread across the earth like plague. But they had not acted. They had waited for instruction, for permission, for the command that would authorize intervention. Angels do not move on their own initiative. They serve. They obey. They act only when directed by the one who sits upon the throne. Now they looked down from the holy heights and saw blood being poured out upon the earth in quantities that overwhelmed comprehension. They saw the Nephilim devouring humanity. They saw the violence, the sorcery, the complete breakdown of the order that had existed since creation. They saw suffering that demanded response. The four archangels went inside the gates of heaven. In some chamber within the sacred precincts, they spoke to one another with voices heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. The voice of those who are crying out on earth has reached the gates of heaven, they said. The cry could not be ignored. The suffering could not be left unaddressed. The corruption could not be allowed to continue unchecked. Something must be done. The archangels brought the cry before the Most High. They stood before the throne and reported what had been done, what had been taught, what had been unleashed. Their words carried the weight of direct observation, of angelic authority, of faithful servants who had maintained their posts while others had abandoned theirs. They spoke of the watchers who had descended without permission, 200 angels who had crossed the boundary between realms, who had taught humanity forbidden knowledge, who had taken human women as wives in violation of every sacred separation. They named the leaders, Semjaza, Azazel, and the others who had orchestrated the rebellion and led their fellows into transgression. They reported the teaching that had corrupted humanity, the secrets of metalworking that produced weapons of unprecedented lethality, the knowledge of cosmetics and enchantments that turned beauty into manipulation, the revelation of astrology and divination that enslaved humans to superstition, the instruction in sorcery that opened doors between realms that should have remained sealed, all the forbidden arts that heaven had guarded in wisdom, but the watchers had poured forth without restraint. They described the Nephilim who devoured the earth, giants born from forbidden unions, beings that violated the natural order by their very existence, creatures whose appetites consumed resources faster than nature could replenish them, whose violence terrorized populations that had no means of defense, whose presence demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of boundaries crossed and covenant broken. They spoke of humanity corrupted beyond recognition. The people who had once lived in innocence now practiced arts that violated creation itself. Communities that had existed in relative peace now waged wars of unprecedented brutality. Relationships that had formed naturally now operated through manipulation and deception. Children, who should have grown in simplicity, now developed cunning before they could walk. The image bearers of the divine, meant to tend creation in harmony with its design, had become agents of destruction. The archangels laid it all before the throne, the full scope of the catastrophe, the complete extent of the corruption, the total devastation that had unfolded since the watchers descended. They spoke not just as observers but as intercessors, bringing the cry of the suffering before the one who had the power to respond. Heaven's response was not immediate. There was no thunderous declaration of judgment, no instant pronouncement of doom, no hasty reaction to the crisis unfolding on earth. The response was measured, deliberate, considered with the weight that befitted matters of cosmic consequence. This was not because heaven did not care. It was not indifference or delay born from inattention. It was the measured response of perfect wisdom addressing devastation that, while catastrophic, required judgment that would stand for all eternity. What was decided would not be reversed. What was pronounced would not be recalled. The sentence must be just, complete, and final. The Creator had seen what unfolded. Nothing that occurred on earth had been hidden from divine sight. The descent of the Watchers, the teaching of forbidden knowledge, the unions with human women, the birth of the Nephilim, the corruption of humanity, the violence that soaked the soil with blood, the sorcery that poisoned the air, all of it had been witnessed from the moment it began. More than witnessed, it had been known. The one who exists outside time had seen the end from the beginning, had understood before the first watcher descended what consequences would follow. The knowledge did not prevent the grief. The foreknowledge did not diminish the sorrow. The grief was real. Heaven mourned what had been lost, the innocence that would never return, the simplicity that had been shattered, the world that had existed in harmony with its design, now twisted beyond recognition, the boundary that had preserved both realms in their proper place, now torn and trampled, the trust that had existed between heaven and earth, now broken by those who should have been its guardians. There was sorrow for humanity, who had received gifts they were never meant to carry and now bore burdens that crushed them. Sorrow for the earth, which groaned beneath corruption it could not sustain. Sorrow even for the Watchers, who had descended in what they believed was mercy and had unleashed devastation instead. But sorrow did not prevent judgment. Grief did not eliminate justice. The wickedness was too great. The corruption was too complete. The violation was too fundamental to be addressed through anything less than decisive intervention. Heaven acknowledged the catastrophe in its totality. This was not partial corruption that could be reformed through gentle correction. This was not isolated transgression that could be addressed through limited response. This was systemic breakdown of the order that sustained creation. This was violation so complete that the world itself could not continue as it was. The archangels stood before the throne and received their instructions. Each would have a role in what was to come. Each would serve as instrument of divine judgment, not acting from their own authority, but as extensions of the will that spoke universes into being. The decision was made. Divine judgment must fall. The teaching had been sin, not merely mistake or poor judgment, but actual transgression against divine command. The Watchers had known the boundary existed. They had understood why it was maintained. They had chosen to cross it anyway, believing their compassion superseded heaven's wisdom. Their mercy justified their disobedience. They had been wrong, catastrophically, undeniably wrong. The evidence spread across the earth in blood and corruption and broken bodies. The results spoke with clarity that could not be disputed. The teaching had not elevated humanity. It had destroyed them. The gifts had not blessed. They had cursed. The mercy had not helped. It had harmed beyond measure. The corruption had been consequence, not arbitrary punishment imposed by an angry deity, but natural result of boundaries crossed and order violated. When creation's fundamental structures are broken, creation itself breaks down. When sacred separations are ignored, chaos rushes in to fill the space that order once occupied. When knowledge meant for immortals is given to mortals, the mortals are crushed beneath weight they were never designed to carry. Now justice would be delivered, not in haste, but with the weight of eternity behind it, not as revenge, but as necessity, not to satisfy anger, but to restore what could still be restored and remove what had become irredeemably corrupted. The judgment would be comprehensive. It would address the Watchers who had descended. It would deal with the Nephilim who had been born. It would cleanse the earth that had been corrupted. It would preserve a remnant through whom creation could begin again. Every aspect of the catastrophe would be answered with corresponding justice. The sentence was measured against the transgression. The Watchers had left their appointed places to descend to earth. They would be removed from earth and bound in darkness, unable to return to heaven, unable to remain among those they had corrupted. They had taught forbidden knowledge. That knowledge could not be erased, but its sources would be eliminated. They had produced offspring that violated the natural order. Those offspring would be destroyed, removed from existence as thoroughly as if they had never been born. The judgment carried sorrow even as it carried justice. There was no pleasure in what must be done, no satisfaction in the pronouncement of sentence against beings who had once stood faithful, who had served their appointed roles for ages before falling. But the corruption could not be allowed to continue. The devastation could not spread unchecked. The order of creation had to be restored, even if restoration required destruction of what had become irreparably broken. The 4 archangels received their specific assignments. Each would carry out a particular aspect of the judgment. Each would serve as instrument of divine will, executing sentence with precision that left no room for mercy beyond what had already been measured into the decree. Michael, greatest among the archangels, would bind Semjaza and his confederates. The leader of the Watchers and those who had sworn the oath with him on Mount Hermon would be imprisoned in darkness beneath the earth, held there until the final judgment when their fate would be sealed forever. They would witness the destruction of everything they had built, watch helplessly as their offspring were eliminated, know the full weight of what their choice had cost. Gabriel would provoke the Nephilim to destroy one another. The giants who had terrorized humanity would turn their violence inward, battling among themselves until none remained. They would fall not primarily to human weapons, but to their own corrupted nature, consuming themselves as they had consumed everything else. Their destruction would come through the very violence they had spread across the earth. Raphael would bind Azazel, the one who had taught humanity the secrets of weapons and warfare, who had revealed cosmetics and the arts of deception, would be cast into the desert and covered with jagged stones. He would be left in darkness until the day of judgment, bearing special punishment for the particular knowledge he had shared, suffering isolation that matched the separation he had caused between humanity and their original innocence. Uriel would warn the faithful. Not all of humanity had been corrupted beyond redemption. A remnant remained, those who had not bowed to the Nephilim, who had not practiced the forbidden arts, who had maintained their devotion despite the chaos surrounding them. Uriel would go to Noah, the one found righteous in his generation, and warn him of what was coming. He would provide instruction for survival, ensuring that when judgment fell, a seed would remain through whom humanity could begin again. The sentence carried finality. There would be no appeal, no reconsideration, no softening of what had been decreed. The judgment had been measured with perfect justice. It accounted for every aspect of the transgression and provided corresponding response. Nothing excessive, nothing insufficient, simply what was required to address corruption that threatened to consume all of creation. The teaching had been sin, and sin demanded consequence. The watchers had acted without permission, crossed boundaries without authorization, taught what should never have been revealed. Their compassion, sincere though it may have been, had unleashed devastation. Their mercy, well-intentioned though they believed it, had become curse. Their love, misdirected and unrestrained, had produced corruption. The corruption had been consequence, and consequence demanded justice. The earth groaned beneath weight it could not carry. Humanity suffered under knowledge they were never meant to bear. The Nephilim existed in violation of natural law. The blood of the innocent cried from the ground. The natural order bent toward breaking. Creation itself petitioned for relief. Justice would be delivered with the weight of eternity behind it. This was not a temporary measure, not a warning shot, not a mild correction meant to reform behavior. This was comprehensive judgment that would remove the corruption, bind the corruptors, cleanse the corrupted, and preserve the remnant through whom life could continue. The archangels departed from the throne with their assignments clear. They knew what must be done. They understood why it was necessary. They carry no hesitation, no doubt, no reservation about the justice of what they would execute. They had brought the cry of the earth before heaven. They had reported the full extent of the catastrophe. They had received the response, and now they would implement it with the precision and authority of those who served the throne directly. The cry that had risen from earth had reached heaven. The suffering had been acknowledged. The catastrophe had been assessed. The judgment had been pronounced. Now the archangels would descend, not in rebellion like the watchers, but in obedience, not to teach but to execute, not to help but to cleanse. The age of corruption was ending. The time of judgment had come, and heaven, moved by the cry of the innocent and the plea of creation itself, would act with justice that was both terrible and necessary, sorrowful and right, devastating and redemptive all at once. The sentence would fall. The watchers would be bound. The Nephilim would be destroyed. The earth would be cleansed. And from the remnant that remained, creation would begin again. Heaven's decree was swift and absolute. There would be no negotiation, no opportunity for the watchers to explain their intentions or defend their choices, no softening of what had been decided. The judgment had been measured with perfect justice, accounting for every aspect of the transgression, and now it would be executed with the precision that characterized all divine action. The watchers would be bound. They who had descended from their appointed places in freedom would be imprisoned in darkness. They who had crossed boundaries without permission would find themselves confined beyond any hope of escape. They who had taught humanity secrets that corrupted the earth would be removed from the earth entirely, cast into places beneath the surface where light did not penetrate and hope did not reach. They would remain there until the final judgment, not for a season or an age, but until the end of all things, until the day when every deed would be weighed, every choice evaluated, every consequence fully revealed. Then, and only then, would their fate be sealed completely. Until that day, they would exist in imprisonment that served as both punishment and containment, keeping them from causing further corruption while they awaited ultimate sentence. The pronouncement began with Azazel. Among all the watchers, he bore particular responsibility. He had taught the forging of weapons that made warfare devastating. He had revealed the crafting of cosmetics that turned beauty into deception. He had shown humanity arts that corrupted more deeply than others, that planted seeds of vanity and violence that spread beyond containment. The command went to Raphael, the healer among the archangels. Bind Azazel by his hands and his feet and throw him into the darkness. The one who had descended in what he believed was mercy would be treated with justice unmixed with clemency. His hands that had taught forbidden arts would be bound. His feet that had walked among humans teaching corruption would be restrained. Split open the desert which is in Uriel and throw him there. A specific location, a desert place, barren and remote, fitting for one whose teaching had turned fertile civilization into wasteland of violence and corruption. Uriel, a name that would become synonymous with exile and punishment, with separation from all that was good and right. And throw on him jagged and sharp stones, and cover him with darkness, not merely bound, but buried beneath rough stones that cut and crushed, covered in darkness so complete that no trace of light could reach him. Azazel, who had walked in the radiance of heavenly realms, would know only shadow. He who had revealed secrets to humanity would be hidden where no one could find him. Let him stay there forever and cover his face, that he may not see light. The sentence was eternal, not temporary containment but permanent imprisonment. His face would be covered so that even if light somehow penetrated his prison, he would not be able to perceive it. He who had brought forbidden illumination to humanity would exist in perpetual darkness. And that on the great day of judgment he may be hurled into the fire. The imprisonment was not the final sentence. It was containment until the ultimate judgment, when he would face the full consequence of what he had done. The fire awaited, consuming, purifying, destroying what could not be redeemed. The command to Raphael continued, "And restore the earth which the angels have ruined, and announce the restoration of the earth, for I shall restore the earth." Judgment served dual purpose. It removed the corruption and prepared the way for healing. Raphael's assignment included not just binding Azazel but beginning the process of restoration that would follow the cleansing. The earth would be healed, but first it must be purged. The other watchers received similar sentence. They would be bound and cast into darkness, imprisoned beneath the earth in valleys that burned with eternal fire. They would be held in chains that could not be broken, in prisons that offered no escape, until the day of final judgment when their fate would be determined completely. Semjaza, their leader, would be bound by Michael. The greatest of the archangels would take personal responsibility for imprisoning the one who had led the rebellion, who had gathered the 200 on Mount Hermon, who had convinced them to swear the oath that sealed their fate. Semjaza would watch helplessly as everything he had built was destroyed, as his offspring were eliminated, as the teaching he had championed was revealed as curse rather than blessing. The Nephilim, the offspring born from forbidden unions, would be made to destroy one another. Gabriel received this assignment, to provoke the giants into turning their violence inward, to manipulate their corrupted natures so that they would battle among themselves until none remained. The giants who had terrorized humanity, who had devoured the earth's resources and then humanity itself, would consume one another in their final act. Their strength would become their destruction. Their violence would be their end. They would fall not primarily to human weapons, which could barely harm them, but to each other, equals in power, matched in brutality, driven to mutual annihilation by divine intervention working through their own corrupted impulses. This was justice that matched the crime. The Nephilim had spread violence across the earth. They would end in violence. They had shown no mercy to those weaker than themselves. They would receive no mercy from those equal to themselves. They had disrupted the natural order by their existence. Their removal would come through the very chaos they had created. Gabriel would go against the bastards and the reprobates and against the children of the Watchers. He would stir them to warfare, inciting conflict that would spread through their ranks until every giant fell. The earth would be cleansed of these beings who should never have been born, whose existence violated creation's fundamental design, whose presence threatened to consume everything if allowed to continue. The judgment against the Nephilim carried particular tragedy. They had not chosen to be born. They had not asked for the nature they possessed, part human, part angelic, wholly incompatible with the world they inhabited. They were victims of their father's transgression even as they became perpetrators of violence themselves, yet their existence could not be permitted to continue. They were living violations of the order that sustained creation. Their removal was necessity, not cruelty. The knowledge that had been taught could not be erased. This was perhaps the most sobering aspect of the judgment. The secrets the Watchers had revealed to humanity were now embedded in human consciousness. The arts of warfare, cosmetics, sorcery, divination, astrology, all of it would remain in human culture, passed from generation to generation. The forbidden knowledge would persist even after its sources were removed. But those sources would be eliminated. The Watchers who had taught would be bound in darkness, unable to provide further instruction. The Nephilim who embodied the violation of boundaries would be destroyed. The direct corruption would be cut off at its root, even if the fruits it had produced continued to affect humanity for generations to come. The archangels were sent as executors of divine will. They did not act from their own authority or according to their own judgment. They were instruments, servants carrying out commands they had received from the throne. Each had a specific assignment. Each would fulfill their role with precision that left no room for deviation. Michael, greatest among them, would bind Semjaza and his confederates. He would descend with authority that could not be resisted, chains that could not be broken, and execute judgment against those who had led the rebellion. His strength would overpower those who had believed themselves powerful. His obedience would stand in stark contrast to their disobedience. Gabriel would provoke the Nephilim into self-destruction. He would work not through direct combat, but through manipulation of the very violence the giants had spread. He would turn their corrupted natures against themselves, ensuring that the beings who had consumed so much would finally consume each other. His assignment required not just power but strategy, not just authority but wisdom in execution. Raphael would heal the earth after the purging. His name meant God heals, and his role embodied this meaning. He would bind Azazel first, removing the one whose teaching had corrupted most deeply. Then he would begin the work of restoration, announcing healing, preparing the earth for renewal, setting in motion the processes that would allow creation to recover from the devastation it had endured. Uriel would warn the faithful of what was coming. Not all of humanity deserved destruction. A remnant remained, those who had not practiced the forbidden arts, who had not worshipped the Nephilim, who had maintained their devotion despite the chaos surrounding them. Uriel would go to Noah, the one found righteous in his generation, and provide warning and instruction. He would ensure that when judgment fell completely, a seed would survive through whom humanity could begin again. The judgment carried theological weight that extended beyond the immediate situation. This was not merely practical response to a crisis. This was divine statement about the nature of order, the importance of boundaries, the consequences of transgression. The sentence pronounced against the Watchers would echo through all of history as testimony to what happens when beings cross lines that should never be crossed. The Watchers had acted in what they believed was love. They had descended in compassion, convinced that mercy dim. And did they teach what heaven had withheld? They had believed their intentions justified their actions, that the good they meant to do excused the boundaries they crossed. They had been sincere in their conviction that helping humanity required violating divine command. But their actions had brought devastation. The teaching had corrupted rather than elevated. The gifts had cursed rather than blessed. The mercy had destroyed rather than saved. Sincerity of intention did not change the reality of consequence. Good motives did not sanctify disobedience. Love without wisdom had become the most destructive force imaginable. Heaven, in its righteousness, could not allow rebellion to stand unpunished. The order of creation depended on boundaries being respected, on sacred separations being maintained, on creatures honoring the limits established for their good. When those boundaries were violated, when the order was broken, justice demanded response that would restore what could be restored and remove what had become irredeemably corrupted. The sentence was eternal. The Watchers would not serve a finite punishment and then be released. They would not be given opportunity to reform, to demonstrate repentance, to earn their way back to their former positions. They had crossed a line that, once crossed, could not be recrossed. They had broken something that could not be mended. Their judgment would last until the final day, and on that day the sentence would be made complete and irrevocable. This permanence reflected the seriousness of what they had done. They had not committed simple transgression that could be corrected through discipline and restoration. They had violated the fundamental architecture of creation. They had taught what should never have been taught. They had produced offspring that should never have been born. They had corrupted humanity so thoroughly that the earth itself cried out for relief. Such transgression demanded corresponding consequence. The teaching was called sin, not mistake, not error in judgment, not well-intentioned action that produced unfortunate results. Sin, deliberate violation of divine command, crossing of boundaries that were known and understood, choice to prioritize personal conviction over obedience to the one who established the order they violated. The Watchers had known they were transgressing. They had understood the boundary existed. They had recognized they were acting without permission. The oath they swore on Mount Hermon demonstrated their awareness. They bound themselves together specifically because they knew what they were doing carried weight, required shared responsibility, would result in consequence they could not face alone. Their knowledge made their choice inexcusable. The angels who had descended would never again see the light of heaven. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the judgment, not the physical imprisonment, not the darkness or the stones or the fire, but the permanent separation from the presence they had known since their creation. They would never again stand in the light of the throne, never again join the songs of praise that echoed through the heavenly realm, never again fulfill the purpose for which they had been made. They had exchanged eternal glory for temporary satisfaction. They had traded their place in heaven for the opportunity to teach mortals. They had surrendered their position in the divine hierarchy for unions with human women, and the exchange was permanent. What they had lost could not be regained. What they had given up could not be reclaimed. The judgment served multiple purposes. It removed the immediate sources of corruption from the earth. It demonstrated heaven's response to rebellion, showing that even well-intentioned transgression carried consequence. It preserved a remnant through whom creation could continue. It announced that order would be restored, that boundaries did matter, that the architecture of creation could not be violated without cost. The sentence also carried mercy within it, though not for the Watchers themselves. By removing them from the earth, by binding them so they could not continue their corruption, judgment prevented even greater devastation. If they had been allowed to continue, if their teaching had spread unchecked, if their offspring had multiplied without restraint, The result would have been total destruction of all life. The judgment, severe though it was, actually limited the damage, contained the corruption, prevented the complete annihilation that would otherwise have occurred. The theological weight of the pronouncement extended beyond the specific situation. This was heaven's statement about the nature of obedience, the importance of boundaries, the consequences of crossing sacred lines. It established precedent that would echo through all of history, that intention does not excuse transgression, that compassion does not justify disobedience, that claiming to act in love does not sanctify rebellion against divine order. The watchers had believed they understood better than heaven. They had convinced themselves their mercy was wiser than divine restraint. They had trusted their own judgment over the command they had been given. The judgment pronounced against them demonstrated, with finality that could not be disputed, that they had been wrong. Utterly, completely, catastrophically wrong. The archangels received their instructions and prepared to execute them. They felt no hesitation. They harbored no doubt. They recognized the justice of what they had been commanded to do. They had witnessed the devastation the watchers unleashed. They had heard the cry of the earth. They had seen humanity corrupted, the Nephilim devouring, the natural order breaking beneath weight it could not sustain. They understood that what they were about to do was not cruelty but necessity, not revenge but restoration. Michael would bind the leaders who had organized the rebellion. Gabriel would eliminate the offspring who should never have existed. Raphael would heal the earth after the purging. Uriel would preserve the remnant through whom life would continue. Each assignment fit the nature of the archangel who received it. Each would be executed with the precision and authority of those who served the throne directly. The judgment was pronounced. The sentence was set. The executors were assigned their tasks. Now the decree would be implemented, carried out with the same swiftness and absoluteness that characterized its pronouncement. The watchers would be bound. The Nephilim would be destroyed. The earth would be cleansed. And from the ashes of judgment, creation would begin again. The age of corruption was ending. The time of binding had come. And the angels who had descended in what they called mercy would learn, in darkness and isolation that would last until the end of all things, that mercy without permission is transgression, that compassion without obedience is rebellion, and that the teaching heaven regretted giving carried consequences that no amount of good intention could erase. The earth had become so corrupted that only one solution remained: total cleansing. The binding of the watchers addressed the source of the teaching. The destruction of the Nephilim eliminated the offspring of transgression, but the corruption they had unleashed had spread too deeply into the fabric of human civilization to be removed through targeted judgment alone. The knowledge could not be erased. The violence had become embedded in human nature. The sorcery had poisoned the spiritual atmosphere. The blood had soaked so deeply into the soil that the earth itself cried for purging. Heaven looked upon the world and saw corruption so complete that nothing remained untouched. Every intention of human hearts was bent toward evil continually. The violence filled the earth. The forbidden arts were practiced openly. The natural order had broken under the weight of beings and knowledge that violated its design. Creation itself had been wounded beyond what partial measures could heal. The decree was pronounced. The earth would be cleansed with water, not rain alone, but flood water that would cover everything, that would wash away all that had been corrupted, that would reset creation to a state from which it could begin again. The world that had existed since the watchers descended would be erased. What remained would be only what was preserved through divine intention. The Great Flood was not merely a story of rain and water. It was the erasure of a world that had been poisoned by forbidden knowledge, by intermingling, by rebellion against divine order. It was judgment that functioned as mercy, destroying what could not be redeemed in order to preserve what still held the possibility of restoration. The flood would be complete. It would cover the highest mountains. It would drown every living thing that breathed air and walked on land. It would eliminate the Nephilim who had terrorized humanity. It would wash away the blood that had soaked the soil. It would cleanse the earth of the corruption that had made it uninhabitable for those who still sought to live according to the order originally established. But before destruction came, provision was made for preservation. Noah, a man found righteous in his generation, was chosen to preserve a remnant. Among all the humans who walked the corrupted earth, he alone maintained his integrity. He had not practiced the forbidden arts. He had not bowed to the Nephilim. He had not allowed the corruption surrounding him to infiltrate his household. He walked with God in a generation that had largely abandoned such walking. The command came to Noah through Uriel, the archangel assigned to warn the faithful. Build an ark. Construct a vessel capable of riding out the flood that would cover the earth. Make it large enough to hold not just his family but representatives of the animal kingdom, pairs of every kind, preserved so that life could continue after the waters receded. The ark was not escape. It was continuation. Noah did not build it to flee from judgment but to carry forward what remained pure, to preserve through the cleansing what could serve as seed for the world that would follow. The vessel represented divine mercy operating within divine judgment. The same God who decreed total destruction also provided means of salvation for those who would accept it. Noah built as he was commanded. He labored for years, constructing something massive and unprecedented, a ship built far from any sea, prepared for a flood no one else believed would come. He preached while he worked, warning those around him of the judgment approaching, calling them to repentance, offering them place in the ark if they would turn from their corruption. They did not listen. They saw the ark rising timber by timber and mocked the man building it. They heard his warnings and dismissed them. They continued in their violence and sorcery and forbidden practices, convinced that nothing would change, that the world would continue as it always had. They could not imagine, or refused to imagine, that the corruption they had normalized would be answered with destruction so complete that nothing would survive outside the vessel one righteous man was building. The ark was completed. The animals came as they were commanded, pairs of every kind, clean and unclean, walking into the vessel as if guided by invisible hands. Noah's family entered, 8 souls total, the remnant through whom humanity would continue. They brought with them not just their physical bodies but their memories, their knowledge, their understanding of what had existed before. They carried within them the echoes of a corrupted world even as they prepared to survive its cleansing. The door of the ark was sealed, not by Noah's hand but by divine action. The same authority that commanded the flood also secured the vessel that would ride above it. Those inside were protected. Those outside were condemned. The line between salvation and destruction was as clear as the threshold of the ark itself. Then the flood came. The rain began. Not the gentle rain that watered crops or the passing storm that brought temporary downpour. This was rain that fell without stopping, rain that pounded the earth day after day, night after night, rain that came from above while waters burst forth from beneath. The fountains of the deep broke open. Water that had been held beneath the surface of the earth erupted, joining the deluge from the sky in a convergence that covered everything. The waters rose. They covered the fields first, turning farmland into lakes. They swept through valleys, carrying away everything in their path. They climbed hillsides, drowning forests and villages built in places humans had thought were safe. They continued rising until even the mountains disappeared beneath the surface, until nothing remained visible but endless water stretching to every horizon. The Nephilim drowned. These giants who had terrorized humanity, who had consumed the earth's resources and then humanity itself, who had seemed invincible in their strength and unstoppable in their violence, They died in the flood like everything else that breathed air. Their size could not save them. Their power could not protect them. The water that covered the earth did not distinguish between giant and ordinary human. All flesh that moved upon the land perished. Some accounts would later claim the spirits of the Nephilim did not die with their bodies, that they became something else, wandering entities, demons that would plague humanity in the ages to come. Whether literal truth or symbolic expression, the idea captured a reality. The corruption the giants embodied did not entirely disappear. It left traces, echoes, influences that would persist even after the flood receded. The earth was washed clean of blood. The soil that had absorbed violence in quantities it was never meant to hold was purged. The ground that had cried out for relief received it through water that covered everything, that dissolved the stains, that carried away the evidence of what had been done. When the waters receded, the earth would be renewed, ready to support life again without bearing the accumulated weight of generations of bloodshed. The sorcery was cleansed from the air. The spiritual pollution that had hung over the earth like a shroud, the constant practice of enchantments, the manipulation of forces beyond mortal understanding, the opening of doors between realms, was washed away by water that served purposes both physical and spiritual. The flood reset not just the surface of the earth, but the unseen dimensions that had been corrupted along with it. The violence was eliminated. Every warrior who had wielded weapons forged through knowledge Azazel taught, every tyrant who had used strength to dominate the weak, every predator who had hunted humans as prey, all of them perished in water that rose without mercy, that gave no second chances, that executed judgment as complete as the corruption it answered. The world that had existed was erased. The cities humans had built using knowledge they were never meant to possess disappeared beneath the water. The forges where weapons had been crafted were silenced. The temples where Nephilim had been worshipped crumbled and sank. The entire civilization that had grown from the teaching the Watchers provided was eliminated, leaving no trace except what survived in the memories of the 8 souls preserved in the ark. But the knowledge itself did not drown. This was the tragedy that persisted through the cleansing. The forbidden arts the Watchers had taught could not be washed away by water. They existed not just as physical techniques, but as understanding embedded in human consciousness. The knowledge of metalworking, of cosmetics, of astrology, of divination, of sorcery, all of it survived in the minds of those who entered the ark. Noah and his family carried memories of the world before the flood. They had seen the weapons forged. They had witnessed the cosmetics applied. They had observed the stars being read for omens. They had watched the practice of enchantments. They could not unknow what they had learned through observation, even if they had not practiced the arts themselves. The knowledge would survive in fragments, in whispers, in the memories of those who lived after. Future generations would rediscover metalworking, not because the Watchers taught them directly, but because the principles had been learned and could be learned again. They would recreate cosmetics, rebuild astrology, reinvent divination. The specific techniques might be lost, but the concepts would re-emerge because humans now knew such things were possible. The world itself was reset. When the waters finally receded, when the ark came to rest on solid ground, when Noah and his family emerged to find earth washed clean and waiting for new beginning, the physical corruption had been removed. The Nephilim were gone. The practitioners of forbidden arts had perished. The violent civilizations had been eliminated. The earth stood ready to support life again without the crushing weight of beings and knowledge that had nearly destroyed it. The flood functioned as divine response to corruption, so complete that nothing less than total cleansing could address it. It was judgment, yes, absolute and comprehensive, answering violence with violence, responding to corruption with destruction. But it was also mercy. It prevented the complete annihilation that would have occurred if the Nephilim had continued multiplying, if humanity had continued its descent into depravity, if the corruption had spread unchecked until nothing remained but chaos. The theological meaning of cleansing through destruction revealed a paradox. The same act that killed also saved. The water that drowned the corrupted also bore up the ark containing the remnant. The judgment that ended one world made possible the beginning of another. Destruction and preservation operated simultaneously, two aspects of a single divine action that removed what could not be redeemed while protecting what still held possibility for renewal. This was not cruelty disguised as justice. It was necessity born from the reality that some corruption cannot be reformed, only removed. The world before the flood had become so twisted that gradual correction was impossible. The violence was too embedded. The knowledge was too widespread. The Nephilim were too numerous. Only complete reset could provide opportunity for creation to function according to its original design again. The remnant preserved through Noah carried both hope and sorrow. They were survivors, chosen because of righteousness that persisted despite surrounding corruption. They represented continuity, the thread connecting the world before the flood to the world that would follow. Through them, humanity would have second chance, opportunity to build civilization, without the presence of watchers teaching forbidden arts or Nephilim enforcing tyranny through superior strength. But they also carried scars. They had lived through the age of corruption. They had witnessed violence and sorcery. They had seen what humanity became when given knowledge they were not meant to hold. They remembered the Nephilim. They recalled the teaching. They knew what had been lost and what had been learned. These memories would shape them and their descendants, creating awareness that could serve as either warning or temptation depending on how it was received. The earth was made new, but it was not returned to original innocence. The ground was cleansed of blood, but it remembered what it had absorbed. The air was purified of spiritual pollution, but the doorways that had been opened between realms could be opened again. The world was reset, but it was not the same world that had existed before the Watchers descended. It bore the mark of what had happened, carried within its renewed form the knowledge that boundaries could be crossed, that order could be broken, that corruption could spread until it threatened everything. Humanity was given second chance, but they carried within them echoes of what they had learned and lost. The 8 souls who emerged from the ark brought with them knowledge that could rebuild civilization more quickly than if humanity had to develop everything from nothing. They understood agriculture, animal husbandry, basic technologies. But they also carried memories of more dangerous knowledge, the awareness that metals could be forged into weapons, that stars could be read as omens, that plants could be manipulated for sorcery, that boundaries existed that could be crossed despite divine prohibition. The flood answered the immediate crisis. It eliminated the Nephilim. It removed the practitioners of forbidden arts. It cleansed the earth of accumulated violence. It provided opportunity for fresh start. But it could not, erase the fundamental reality that humanity now knew things they had not known before the Watchers descended. The teaching had been given. The knowledge had been shared. And while the sources were removed and the direct corruption was washed away, the echoes would persist. This was the paradox of judgment and mercy operating together. The same God who decreed destruction also preserved remnant. The same flood that killed millions carried 8 souls to safety. The same divine action that ended one world made possible the beginning of another. Judgment and mercy were not opposites, but complementary expressions of justice that refused to allow corruption to continue, while simultaneously refusing to let corruption have final word. The earth after the flood was both new and ancient. New in that it had been cleansed, reset, prepared for another attempt at civilization that might, if humanity learned from what came before, avoid the mistakes that led to such catastrophic judgment. Ancient in that it carried within its renewed form all the weight of history, all the memory of what had been done, all the knowledge that boundaries had been crossed and consequences had followed. Noah stood on ground washed clean and looked toward a future that held both promise and peril. The Nephilim were gone. The Watchers were bound. The corruption had been cleansed. But humanity remained human, capable of great good and terrible evil, able to build or destroy, free to choose obedience or rebellion. The flood had answered one chapter of corruption. It had not guaranteed that new chapters would not be written. The world was made new. The scars remained. And humanity, preserved through water that destroyed and saved in the same motion, carried forward into an uncertain future the dual legacy of judgment experienced and mercy received. They had survived the cleansing. Now they would discover whether they had learned from it. After the flood, after the binding of the Watchers, after the destruction of the Nephilim, the world began again. The waters receded. The earth dried. The ark released its inhabitants onto ground washed clean of the corruption that had threatened to consume all creation. Noah and his family stepped into a world emptied of violence, purged of sorcery, cleansed of the blood that had soaked so deeply into the soil. The Nephilim were gone. The practitioners of forbidden arts had perished. The civilizations built on knowledge humanity was never meant to possess had been erased. But the knowledge that heaven regretted giving did not vanish completely. It lingered in human memory, passed down through generations in distorted forms. The 8 souls who survived carried with them awareness of what had existed before. They remembered the weapons forged from metal. They recalled the cosmetics that transformed appearance. They had witnessed the reading of stars as omens. They had observed the practice of enchantments. They could not unknow what they had seen, could not erase the understanding that such things were possible. The arts of warfare resurfaced. Not immediately, perhaps. Not in the first generation after the flood when humanity focused on survival and rebuilding. But eventually, someone remembered that rocks could be heated until they yielded metal. Someone recalled that metal could be shaped into tools sharper and stronger than stone. And from tools, the leap to weapons was inevitable. The knowledge Azazel had taught was rediscovered, relearned, rebuilt from fragments of memory and human ingenuity. The practice of astrology returned. Humans looked up at the stars and remembered that others before the flood had read meaning in their movements. They observed patterns in the heavens and convinced themselves those patterns controlled earthly events. The knowledge Gabriel had revealed, the belief that celestial bodies governed human destiny, emerged again, not because Watchers taught it directly, but because the concept had been planted and could not be fully extracted. The arts of enchantment were rediscovered. The specific techniques might have been lost in the flood, but the awareness remained that plants held properties beyond nutrition, that words spoken with intention could affect outcomes, that forces existed beyond visible perception that could be manipulated through ritual and incantation. The knowledge Semjaza had shared found new expression in new generations who experimented until they rediscovered what had been taught in ages past. Humanity could not unlearn what had been taught. This was the lasting tragedy of the Watchers' transgression. The flood had cleansed the earth of its practitioners, but not of the practice itself. The binding had removed the teachers, but not the teaching. The destruction had eliminated those who possessed the knowledge in full, but not the echoes and fragments that survived in the minds of those who had observed from a distance. The teaching had become part of them, woven into their nature. Before the Watchers descended, humanity did not know that certain boundaries could be crossed. They did not conceive of manipulating metal or reading fate in stars or bending reality through sorcery. The knowledge was not merely information, it was transformation. It changed how humans thought, what they imagined possible, how they approached the world around them. Once that change occurred, it could not be reversed. This reality carried profound implications. Heaven had withheld the knowledge for reason, not to keep humanity ignorant but to protect them from truths they were not designed to carry. The Watchers, believing they understood better, had given what should have remained hidden. And now, even after comprehensive judgment, even after flood that covered the earth, even after removal of every source of direct corruption, the knowledge persisted. The lasting legacy of the Watchers' transgression extended far beyond the immediate devastation they caused. The violence, the Nephilim, the corruption, all of these had been addressed through judgment. But the deeper wound remained. Humanity now possessed awareness they could never lose, understanding they could never surrender, knowledge of possibilities they would continue pursuing regardless of consequence. This created tension between divine intention and human curiosity. Heaven had designed humanity with minds capable of learning, with curiosity that drove them to explore and understand their world. This was not flaw but feature, part of what it meant to bear the divine image, to be creatures capable of growth and development. But the same curiosity that led to beneficial discovery also drove humans toward knowledge that harmed rather than helped. Where was the line? How could humanity distinguish between knowledge that elevated and knowledge that destroyed? The answer before the Watchers descended had been simple: heaven maintain. The boundary. What was meant for humanity to know was accessible. What was meant to remain hidden was guarded. Humans could explore freely within their realm without danger of stumbling into truths too heavy to carry. But the Watchers had torn down the boundary. They had revealed what should have remained hidden, believing their act was mercy. And now humanity faced a world where forbidden knowledge existed alongside permitted understanding, where dangerous truths mingled with beneficial learning, where the line between wisdom and destruction was no longer clearly marked. The reason why some knowledge was never meant to be shared became apparent in the aftermath. Knowledge is not neutral. Some truths, once known, change the knower in ways that cannot be reversed. Some understanding carries weight that crushes rather than enlightens. Some secrets, once revealed, open doors that can never be closed again. The knowledge of how to forge weapons gave humanity unprecedented power, but also unprecedented capacity for violence. The understanding of cosmetics provided means of enhancement, but also tools of deception that corrupted relationships. The revelation of astrology offered sense of pattern in chaos, but also surrendered human agency to imagined celestial control. The teaching of sorcery promised power over the unseen, but opened channels to forces that humanity could not safely engage. Each piece of forbidden knowledge carried this dual nature, seeming benefit wrapped around actual harm. Each truth revealed appeared to offer advantage, but actually imposed burden. This was why heaven had guarded these secrets, not because knowledge itself was evil, but because mortals lacked the capacity to wield it without being destroyed by it. The moral weight of teaching itself became clear through the Watchers' example. Teaching is not merely the transfer of information. It is the passing of power, the sharing of capability, the granting of capacity that did not exist before. Teachers bear responsibility not just for what they teach, but for what their students do with that teaching. They cannot control outcomes, but neither can they claim innocence when their instruction leads to devastation. The Watchers had taught with good intentions. They believed they were helping. They convinced themselves that mercy demanded they share what heaven had withheld. But good intentions did not absolve them of responsibility for the consequences. Their teaching had corrupted humanity, produced the Nephilim, led to violence and sorcery that threatened all creation. Their sincerity made the tragedy deeper, not less. This raised questions that echoed through all of history. When is teaching an act of love, and when is it transgression? How does one distinguish between sharing knowledge that helps and revealing truth that harms? What responsibility do those who possess dangerous understanding bear to guard it from those who lack capacity to use it safely? The answers were not simple. They could not be reduced to formulas or rules that applied universally. But the story of the Watchers provided clear example of what happened when boundaries were ignored, when teachers prioritized their own judgment over divine wisdom, when good intentions became justification for crossing lines that should never be crossed. The knowledge that remained after the flood testified to the permanence of certain consequences. Heaven could bind the Watchers. Heaven could destroy the Nephilim. Heaven could cleanse the earth with water that covered everything. But heaven could not, or would not, erase from human consciousness the awareness that had been planted. The knowledge would persist, resurfacing in generation after generation, carried forward by curiosity and memory, and the human drive to rediscover what had been lost. This persistence was not failure of divine judgment. It was recognition of human nature. To erase the knowledge completely would require erasing humanity itself, removing their capacity for memory, their ability to learn, their curiosity that drove them to explore and understand. The flood had addressed the immediate corruption. It could not, without destroying what made humans human, eliminate the echoes of what had been taught. The story closed with meditation on wisdom, restraint, and the sacred boundaries that still existed, even if unseen. Wisdom was not merely the accumulation of knowledge. It was understanding which knowledge to pursue and which to avoid, which truths to speak and which to guard in silence, which boundaries to respect and which could be safely crossed. The Watchers had possessed knowledge without wisdom. They had understood the forbidden arts but lacked the discernment to recognize why those arts should remain forbidden. Their intelligence had been great, but their wisdom had been insufficient. Restraint was the virtue they had failed to practice. They had the power to descend, so they descended. They had knowledge to share, so they shared it. They saw suffering they believed they could alleviate, so they acted. But power does not equal permission. Capability does not equal calling. Compassion does not justify transgression. The restraint to refrain from action, even when action seems beneficial, was the discipline the Watchers lacked and the wisdom they failed to exercise. The sacred boundaries still existed after the flood, even if they were less visible than before. The veil between heaven and earth had been torn by the Watchers' descent, but it was not destroyed completely. Angels still served their appointed roles. Humans still lived within mortal limitations. The order of creation, though wounded, still held. The boundaries were real, even if they seemed easier to cross now that someone had demonstrated they could be violated. Heaven regretted what was given, but that regret could not undo history. The teaching had occurred, the knowledge had spread, the consequences had unfolded. No amount of sorrow, no depth of divine grief could reverse what had been done. The past was fixed. The choices had been made. The results had manifested. Regret acknowledged the tragedy but did not erase it. The teaching became sin, not because knowledge itself was evil. Information carries no moral weight in isolation. Understanding is not inherently corrupting. Truth does not become false simply because it is dangerous. The teaching was sin because it violated divine command, because it crossed boundaries that existed for protection, because it gave to mortals what mortals were not designed to hold. Some truths were too heavy for mortals to bear. This was not judgment of human worth or capability. It was recognition of design. A bird cannot breathe underwater not because it is inferior, but because it is made for air. A fish cannot survive on land not because it is weak, but because it is crafted for water. Humans could not safely wield certain knowledge not because they were unworthy, but because they were mortal, finite, limited by the very nature that allowed them to live and love and experience existence in ways immortals could not. The weight was not moral but existential. The knowledge crushed not through wickedness but through sheer mass. Truths about forces that governed existence, about powers that moved beneath the surface of reality, about capabilities that could reshape the world. These were not meant for beings whose lives lasted decades, whose understanding was bounded by physical senses, whose wisdom came slowly through experience and error. To give such knowledge to mortals was like placing mountain on shoulders of child. The child was not bad, the mountain was not evil, but the child could not carry it without being destroyed. In the quiet after the story, there was stillness. No grand conclusions, no simple lessons, no easy answers that resolved the tension between divine intention and human curiosity, between the boundaries that protected and the desire to transcend them. There was only the slow, eternal turning of time, the movement of ages that witnessed the watchers descend and be bound, the flow of generations that survived the flood and rediscovered what had been lost, the patient unfolding of history where the same patterns repeated, curiosity leading to discovery, discovery leading to knowledge, knowledge carrying consequences that could not be foreseen. The earth continued. Humanity persisted. The knowledge remained, surfacing and resurfacing through the centuries, carried forward by memory and rediscovery, by human ingenuity and the drive to understand what seemed mysterious. The boundaries still existed, though they were harder to see now, more easily crossed because someone had demonstrated they could be violated. Heaven watched, as it had always watched, not with the eyes of watchers who descended in misplaced mercy, but with the gaze of the one who established the order from the beginning. The regret was real, the grief was genuine, but so was the justice that had responded to transgression, the mercy that had preserved a remnant, the wisdom that had maintained boundaries even when beings created to honor them chose to cross them instead. The story ended not with resolution but with rest. Rest in the knowledge that some questions have no simple answers. Rest in the awareness that tension between human curiosity and divine boundaries would persist as long as humans remained mortal. Rest in the understanding that the teaching heaven regretted giving had occurred, had been judged, had left scars that would not fully heal but wounds that would not prove fatal. The listener was invited into this rest, into the stillness of ancient consequence where the urgency of immediate crisis had passed, where the watchers were bound and would remain bound, where the Nephilim were destroyed and would not return, where the flood had cleansed and the remnant had survived and the world had begun again, carrying both weight of what had been and the possibility of what might yet be. In this stillness, sleep could come, not the sleep of ignorance that refused to see, but the sleep of acceptance that recognized some stories end not with triumph but with truth. The truth that boundaries exist for reason. The truth that some knowledge carries weight too heavy for mortals. The truth that good intentions do not justify transgression. The truth that heaven's wisdom, even when it seems restrictive, operates from understanding deeper than mortal minds can fully grasp. And in that truth, there was peace. The peace of creatures who know their place, who honor their limits, who rest in the order that sustains them rather than straining against boundaries that protect them. The peace of those who learn from ancient consequence without needing to repeat it. The peace that comes when the story is told, the lesson is heard, and the night settles in quiet that speaks more clearly than any remaining words. The knowledge remained, the boundaries endured, and in the space between what was known and what was hidden, humanity continued their journey, wiser perhaps for the story they carried, and humbled by the awareness that some gifts once given can never be taken back.